Expecting his proposal, expecting his wife. Written by P.O. Dixon, read by Christopher. Chapter 1. A favourable answer. Rosings Park, Kent. The frequency of Elizabeth's encounters with Mr. Darcy during her rambles within the park excited her hopes beyond measure. Their meetings were not at all by chance either, for he always turned back and walked with her. Their meetings were by his design. He wanted to spend time with her, away from the inquiring eyes of others. His scheme suited Elizabeth just fine. He never said a great deal, and not wanting to give the impression of being just another doting female who was always speaking and looking and thinking for his approbation alone, Elizabeth sought to guard her discourse as well. How sick of civility, of deference, of officious attention he must be. How he must thoroughly despise the persons who so assiduously court him. Elizabeth was far too clever to behave accordingly. When he did talk, he asked odd, unconnected questions about her pleasure in being at Hunsford, her love of solitary walks, and her opinion of Mr. and Mrs. Collins' happiness. In speaking of Rosings, he seemed to expect that whenever she came into Kent again she would be staying there too. The implications of his words could only mean one thing. Her dear friend Charlotte, in whose home Elizabeth was a guest, had once or twice suggested to Elizabeth the possibility of Mr. Darcy's being partial to her. Elizabeth always laughed, for it would not do to allow her friend to know just how keen she was on the idea. Elizabeth proceeded slowly along the path. She was growing a bit concerned that the time was quickly approaching for Mr. Darcy to be away from Kent, and still he had not proposed to her. Her confidence that it was only a matter of time waned with each passing minute. What on earth was I thinking that I might attract such a man? She was no stranger to the fact that Mr. Darcy supposedly was promised to his cousin Miss Anne de Bourgh. Indeed, her curiosity to know more about the young woman who held the position she often had wished was her own was one of the things that persuaded her to accept Charlotte's invitation. Even though it would mean spending weeks in the company of her odious cousin, Mr. William Collins, whose hand Elizabeth had wisely spurned, it would be well worth it. Whenever Elizabeth found herself in the company of Mr. Darcy and his cousin at Rosings, she often looked at Darcy to see how affectionately he regarded Mr. Bourgh, but never once could she discern any symptom of love. On the other hand, Elizabeth had felt herself the happy recipient of a great deal of his attention. He had given hints of admiring her in Hertfordshire as well. Never expecting she might ever see him again after he and his friend Charles Bingley hastily returned to London, soon after the Netherfield ball, Elizabeth's surprise in seeing him in Kent was palpable. Her delight in being the recipient of his ardent attentions once again was even more so. She could not think of Darcy's leaving without giving some thought to his cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam's leave-taking as well. Elizabeth had often been in company with both gentlemen over the past weeks. No doubt in his cousin's company, Darcy's attentions to her were nowhere near as unguarded as when she and Darcy were alone, and he showed her those hints of his true character others did not often see. Where Darcy was reserved, which some regarded as haughty and aloof, the Colonel was eager to please. Though not as handsome as Darcy and certainly not as rich, the Colonel, being the second son of an Earl, was very much the gentleman, amiable and well-bred, with no problems at all recommending himself to everyone. I am certain the Colonel charms people everywhere he goes. Indeed, he was the kind of gentleman whom most women dreamed of calling their own. In fact, it was the Colonel who found himself by her side whenever they were in each other's company, and Elizabeth had begun to feel that he might fancy himself in love with her, and might offer for her. How unenviable would she feel if put in the position of having to consider the proposal of the one man, when it was the incidental touches, the stirring debates, the longing looks, and the rich baritone voice of the other that had made a lasting impression upon her heart. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy of Pemberley in Derbyshire, the brooding Adonis-like man with dark hair and dark eyes, who too often crept into her dreams since the night they first danced together at the Meryton Assembly, and whose hands lingered upon hers a bit too long as they moved through the two dances at the Netherfield ball. Perplexing man, how fortunate am I that I never gave him cause to suspect the true depth of my regard for him, else he might then have treated me with an equal measure of indifference as he affords Mr. Bourgh. After congratulating herself that no one need ever know how much her heart had been engaged by the prospect of capturing Mr. Darcy's fancy, she began to consider that all in all she had no cause to repine. Her trip had indeed been very pleasant. The 5 weeks that she had now passed in Kent had made a great difference in the countryside, and every day everything she saw and heard reminded her why she loved the springtime. She was on the point of turning back when she caught a glimpse of Mr. Darcy pacing in the lane just up ahead. She halted her steps and observed him. From where she stood, she detected he was absorbed in deep thought despite his animated gestures. Whatever was troubling him, Elizabeth was determined to discover, and she set off to meet him. Startled, he quickly tucked the paper he was studying so diligently into his pocket. "Miss Elizabeth?" "Mr. Darcy, I saw you walking back and forth looking as though you carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. Pray, whatever is the matter?" "The fact is, I do have a great deal on my mind. I've been walking in the grove some time in the hope of meeting you this morning." His demeanour then became more urgent. "In vain I have struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." His declaration sent her heartbeat racing. But why was she so stunned? Had this not been what she was hoping for? That she would be the woman to win this man's heart? Still, she had been dreaming of the moment for so long, perhaps this too was a dream. "You love me, Mr. Darcy?" "Indeed, I love you. Most ardently. Please do me the honour of accepting my hand." Elizabeth's astonishment rendered her speechless. Did she proceed to prolong his suspense with half-hearted protests according to the usual practice of elegant females? That ridiculous Mr. Collins had accused her of that very thing when he had offered his hand to her in marriage last autumn. Of course, she had refused him, and in no uncertain terms. The odious man then proposed to her friend Charlotte, and to Elizabeth's dismay, Charlotte accepted him. Cognizant that Mr. Darcy was speaking, the precise words he spoke escaped her as she attempted to rid her mind of the events of the past and focus upon her promising future. A light touch on her hand unleashed a wave of excitement throughout her body. He had touched her hand before on several occasions. She even knew what it was like to feel the soft brush of his lips against her skin, but nothing compared to this. "Miss Elizabeth, did you hear a word I said?" "Yes, sir." His eyes questioning, Darcy said, "Yes, you heard me, or yes, you will be my wife." "Yes, I heard you, and yes, I will be your wife." Now it was Darcy's turn to be astonished. He had come to her with every expectation of a favourable reply. However, he had not expected it to be so easily bestowed. He had worked many hours composing the heartfelt words written out on the paper in his pocket, a detailed accounting of his apprehensions and anxieties. Do I dare breathe a word of any of that now? Do I conceal my struggles and flatter her into the belief of my being impelled by unqualified, unalloyed inclination? Elizabeth's dark eyes beaming with joy taught him to think better of it. No, I dare not to say anything of the sort and risk injuring her pride by my honest confession of the scruples that had long prevented my forming any serious design. Darcy raised her hand to his lips and brushed a tender kiss across her knuckles. Resting her hand upon his chest, he said, "Thank you, Miss Elizabeth, for making me the happiest man in all of England." And so it was, Mr. Darcy and Miss Elizabeth Bennet engaged to be married. Not wishing to draw attention to their newfound felicity just yet, they resolved during their return to the parsonage house that no word of their engagement was to be shared with anyone, not even Elizabeth's dearest sister Jane, until Mr. Bennet's consent was asked for and received. Further, Elizabeth was to continue as the Collinses' guest for the next week, and Darcy would remain at Rosings. That way they might enjoy a pleasurable period of courtship there in Kent. Niggling thoughts that sought to encroach upon Elizabeth's joy she immediately dismissed. So pleased was she with the preference he bestowed onto her while neglecting all the other women of his acquaintance that Elizabeth was certain he held her in great esteem. Now she had proof, for she was to be his wife, Mrs. Elizabeth Darcy, the mistress of Pemberley. How sweet the sound! How could Elizabeth object to a scheme that would allow them to become better acquainted, free of the ill wishes and disdain of his aunt, and the exuberant approbations of her mother? Upon arriving at the parsonage, Elizabeth invited Darcy inside, and the two talked of many things in keeping with their aspirations for future marital felicity, until the time for him to return to Rosings was near. Darcy said, "I wish we didn't have to part just now. There's so much I wish to say, and so much I wish to do with you now that we are engaged. Lest you forget, sir, we are to drink tea with Lady Catherine in a matter of hours. There is that, and I indeed look forward to it. However, it's not quite the same as being alone with you, like this." Darcy placed his finger on her cheek and traced a path that stopped short of her slightly parted lips. How breathtaking it was finally to be able to touch the woman who had captured his heart. How he wanted to trail his lips along the path of his fingers. He did not. I don't know how it will be this evening, being in your company and desiring time alone with you as much as I do. We must find a way if we are to avoid raising suspicions that we have reached an understanding. Tell me again that you appreciate my wanting my father to be the first to know. Indeed, it is only proper that we should receive his consent before telling the world. There's also the fact that you love your father very much. Indeed, I confess to his having spoilt me exceedingly. I could tell from seeing the two of you with each other when we were in Hertfordshire. I too intend to spoil you, in different ways, of course. Cupping Elizabeth's chin and lifting her face, their eyes met. In all those ways a man spoils his wife. He brushed his thumb across her lips. You shall never have cause to regret your being so far away from Longbourn. What warm sensations pierced her core with the gentle touch of his hand upon her face. She had often entertained herself with fanciful musings of what it must be like to be kissed by this man, really kissed. Would this be the moment she dreamed of, his soft lips pressed against hers? Would her imaginings even come close to the reality? Moistening her lips, she was on the verge of closing her eyes when his hand fell. Elizabeth inwardly exhaled. Perhaps his fierce wont of adherence to propriety dictated his actions, but oh, how she wished he had tossed such conventions to the wind. On the other hand, what if he had kissed her? Mr. or Mrs. Collins might interrupt us at any minute. You should know, my loveliest Miss Elizabeth Bennet, that I can hardly wait to make you mine. I simply want to shout it from the rooftop that we are to be man and wife. I long to carry you off to Pemberley. It's quite unlike any other place I have ever seen, and I wager you have never seen such a place where nature and man have conspired more to preserve its beauty. If half of what Miss Bingley says about Pemberley is true, I'm sure I shall be delighted. I should like to suppose we will be married by special licence, which means you shall see your new home in a matter of weeks. Elizabeth said, I can hardly wait to share my joy with my eldest sister Jane. Her spirits were quite low when I last saw her in London, but I can well imagine that she will be pleased. Who knows, perhaps our alliance will place her once again in Mr. Bingley's path. Darcy's countenance grew rather unreadable. Supposing it had more to do with the idea of his being tossed in Bingley's sister's path once more, Elizabeth sought to change the subject. Here again, talk of their imminent plans ensued. Once she returned to London and she reunited with her sister, they were to journey on to Longbourn. Shortly thereafter, Darcy would come and speak with her father. Elizabeth prayed her papa would have no misgivings over her hasty acceptance of a future life with Mr. Darcy. No doubt he will be surprised, but that is not to say it should be an unwelcomed surprise. Although the gentleman who sat next to her on the Collinses' sofa had given most everyone to suspect he was proud, and above his company when he attended the Meryton Assembly, Darcy had shown his preference for Elizabeth from the start, when he singled her out as the only woman whom he danced with outside his own party. There was also the time he danced with her and no one else but her at a gathering at Lucas Lodge. His attentions towards Elizabeth had been nowhere nearly so unguarded as his friend's attentions towards Jane, but he had sufficiently flattered Elizabeth's ego enough to give her a favourable impression of his good character. Here was a man she could admire and respect, a man of consequence and one to whom she could easily surrender her heart. When the militia came to town, Elizabeth met a handsome officer named George Wickham. Discovering that the gentleman's opinion of Mr. Darcy was not so favourable as her own, she was not inclined to believe a single word against the upstanding man who had danced with her during the Meryton Assembly. Elizabeth, who considered herself a fine studier of people, was able to look past all the officer's disparaging remarks and see for herself what a fine and decent man Mr. Darcy was. Indeed, of the two men, she easily discerned that George Wickham was the less worthy of her affections, even though both had done an admirable job of flattering her ego. It made perfect sense. George Wickham made a show of adoring the women of his acquaintance in general, whereas Mr. Darcy's admiration of the finer sex was rarely put on display, except with her. Darcy took both her hands in his and drew them to his chest. Surrendering the one, he placed his hand on her chin. How Elizabeth wished they could remain in that attitude a while longer. Though she knew not where the Collinses were, she had every reason to suppose they would be returning to their home shortly. It would not do for either of them to see her and Mr. Darcy together, especially not like this. Charlotte would know immediately what was afoot. It was hard for Elizabeth to hide anything from her intimate friend. Of course, she would be delighted. Elizabeth's cousin, on the other hand, were he wise enough to suspect anything, would likely be ill over the knowledge of an alliance between Darcy and Elizabeth, given that he had provided the means of its coming about by virtue of Elizabeth's being a guest in his home. Unbeknown to the two lovers, they were not alone. Mr. Collins had returned home and entered his humble abode through the house's rear entrance. Having enjoyed the privilege of speaking to his noble patroness's nephew on more than one occasion, he immediately recognised the rich baritone voice emanating from the other side of the partially closed parlour door. Collins was a mixture of pride in being able to receive Mr. Darcy in his home once again and remorse that he had not been there sooner to welcome him properly. Straightening his attire, he stopped short of entering the room. "What have we here?" "Mr. Darcy. Cousin Elizabeth." Turning on his heels, he headed out the front door. "My noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, will want to hear about this." Chapter 2. Formed for each other. Later that day, Elizabeth accompanied the Collinses to Rosings, where they were engaged to drink tea. Were it not for their agreement to tell no one of their happy news until after the intelligence had been communicated to her father and his blessings received, Elizabeth would be presented to Lady Catherine de Bourgh as her future niece that evening. She couldn't help thinking, without a smile, of how the haughty aristocrat would bear the news once it was made widely known. What might she say? How might she behave? These were but a couple of the questions with which Elizabeth amused herself. Much to her delight, it was now Mr. Darcy who sat next to her as she played the pianoforte, as opposed to his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam. With a slight touch of his hand upon hers, Darcy said, "How are you this evening, my love?" Elizabeth's heart flew against her chest, such was her joy in being addressed so. That he would even think of addressing her so intimately told her that his feelings for her were as powerful as her feelings for him. Oh, if only they both had not spent so much of the past week seeking to mask their mutual affection. In a voice meant only for his ears, she said, "Must you ask? We only parted company less than a few hours ago. Pray forgive my eagerness, for although it was a short time ago, it seemed an eternity." Elizabeth and Darcy continued speaking in that vein for a time, oblivious of the fact that they were being observed. Not much transpired in that particular room that went undetected by her ladyship. Throughout the course of the evening she'd seen it all. How her nephew made a spectacle of himself in overtaking his cousin, who meant to sit next to Elizabeth during her lacklustre exhibition. How his rarely bestowed smiles flowed like wine and solely in Elizabeth's direction. But most telling was the manner in which he leaned a bit too close to her, as the two of them spoke in hushed tones. Lady Catherine's expression changed from mildly curious to outwardly aghast. Her ladyship was most seriously displeased, and her sentiments she no longer repressed. She rose from her seat and made her way to the pianoforte. Her voice filled with contempt, she said, "When I was first told of this, I could not allow myself to believe it. But how does one refute such a scandalous notion of an involvement between the two of you when your own behaviour confirms it?" She pointed her walking stick at Elizabeth. "Is this how I am to be repaid for my benevolence towards you, young woman?" "I'm sure I have no idea of what you're accusing me, your ladyship." "Then you deny that you are involved in a scandalous liaison with my nephew Darcy." Darcy stood. "Before you go any further, you should hear what I have to say. I know not the source of your information pertaining to my involvement with Miss Elizabeth, nor does it matter. We had planned to keep this solely between the two of us until Mr. Bennet could be informed. However, I will not have you slander Miss Elizabeth. The fact is, I offered her my hand in marriage today, and she accepted. Other than Elizabeth, there was but one other person in the room whose face did not speak to their astonishment. Elizabeth's friend, Charlotte. Lady Catherine's face took on a heightened shade of pale, and she nearly tumbled and fell. All heads turned when her daughter Anne raced from the room. Elizabeth, in all her joy of receiving a proposal of marriage from the man of her dreams, had taught herself not to suppose Anne might be truly wishing that same joy for herself. Poor Mr. Bourgh, how horrible it must be to have her hopes and dreams shattered in such a manner as this. Standing, Elizabeth headed off behind her. Lady Catherine said, "Where do you suppose you're going?" "I mean to have a word with Mr. Bourgh." "And what do you intend to say?" "I mean to explain." "Explain? Explain? You mean to explain to her how the pretensions of an upstart like yourself have been the means of thwarting the favourite wishes of her dearest aunt, Darcy's own mother, My own sister, Lady Anne, that my Anne and Darcy should be united in wedlock, while in their cradles we planned their union. Actually, I mean to apologise for the way she learned of the engagement. With that, Elizabeth curtsied and went on her way. With even more reliance upon her walking stick, Lady Catherine hobbled behind Elizabeth. Waylaying his aunt with his hand on her arm, Darcy said, "Please give this a rest. Nothing you can do or say will dissuade me from my purposes. I love Miss Elizabeth. I will marry her." Jerking away from her nephew and nearly losing her balance, Lady Catherine cried, "You will do no such thing if I have a say in the matter." Darcy's complexion grew pale with anger. "Miss Elizabeth and I are most fortunate that you do not." The elderly woman directed her steely gaze towards the Collinses who sat next to each other. "That woman whom the two of you invited into your home, and thereby forced into my society, is not someone with whom you are to associate. I insist you tell her to leave post-haste." Charlotte, whose face earlier had borne a mixture of approbation and knowing, stood. "Elizabeth is my guest, and I shall insist that she be allowed to remain at the parsonage for the rest of the week as planned." She looked at her husband to see what, if anything, he might say to contradict her, and was satisfied with the stupefied look on his face. "Now, if you will pardon me, Lady Catherine, I believe I shall seek out my guest and wish her fitting congratulations." With that, she quitted the room, leaving a very shocked Collins speechless, having found himself in the crossfire between his dear wife and his noble patroness. Poor Mr. Collins apologised profusely, saying to her ladyship that he would handle the situation in a manner that would prove satisfactory to all concerned. "See that you do, or else I shall take matters into my own hands." Elizabeth hardly even knew Miss Anne de Bourgh, but that did not mean she was insensitive to the other woman's pain. Perhaps if she knew her better, she would have an easier time explaining things. All Elizabeth's efforts and heartfelt accounts were in vain. Anne refused to be consoled. "You are no better than all the other women who deigned to tempt my cousin with your arts and allurements. To think I was almost taken in by your feigned indifference and cool civility towards him," said Anne. Her eyes welled with tears. "May I be the first to congratulate you on accomplishing a feat that other women of your ilk have been unable to execute successfully." "Mr. Bourgh, it's not like that at all. Why are you even here? You can have nothing of consequence to say to me. I mean to apologise to you for the manner in which you found out about the engagement." Anne said, "What is the usual way for someone to discover that the man to whom one felt herself to be engaged has offered his hand to another? Had I supposed you two were truly destined for each other, I would not have accepted Mr. Darcy's proposal under these circumstances. Our engagement was of a peculiar kind. It was the favourite wish of our mothers. They planned our union while we were in our cradles. Your mothers may have done their part in planning the union, but surely you will agree that its execution depended upon both Mr. Darcy and you. Having heard of the supposed arrangement, I observed the two of you most diligently, and never once did I discern any tender regard on either part. Had you known how much I longed for it, would it have made a difference? What is the point in conjecture? It serves to illustrate your character and reinforce what I now know about you, that you thought only of yourself in accepting my cousin's proposal, and now for selfish reasons of your own, you want me to believe otherwise. Well, it will not do. This union will not be ordained by anyone in the Fitzwilliam family, not even by Georgiana. By your earlier assertion, you have yet to meet her. By the time I've told her about you, you will not wish to meet her." Turning to her companion, a Mrs. Jenkinson, Anne said, "Will you see to it that this woman has no trouble finding her way out the door?" By now, Darcy and Fitzwilliam had managed to calm Lady Catherine down, and desiring to find Elizabeth, Darcy prepared to take his leave. As they were heading out the door, her ladyship said, "Fitzwilliam, if I may, I would like a private audience with you." With that, Darcy went on his way, leaving his aunt and his cousin alone in the room. "You can have no doubt of why I asked to speak with you alone, Fitzwilliam." "I have a fair idea, your ladyship. However, let me just start by saying you're wasting your time if you think I will have any success in changing Darcy's mind. At least you see the folly in his idea of marrying that upstart. I would not go as far as to say that. What do you say? Miss Elizabeth Bennet is a charming woman. There's no reason to suspect Darcy will not be just as happy with her as any other young lady. She is charming indeed. Do not suppose for one instance that I did not see the way the two of you went on with each other. I wager she would have been tempted to accept an offer of marriage from you were you half as rich as Darcy. We shall never know. I want you to tempt her. She strikes me as someone of loose morals. I shall do no such thing. Even if she were not Darcy's choice, Miss Elizabeth is a gentleman's daughter. She deserves to be respected. You speak too soon. I mean to compensate you dearly. Do you suppose for one instance that any matter of compensation would persuade me to do harm to Darcy? £5,000, she stated calmly. Richard bolted from his chair. Lady Catherine, you have insulted me in every possible way. I insist you desist, or I shall know how to act. And this is your final resolve. Very well. I too shall now know how to act. Do not imagine, Fitzwilliam, that your cousin's foolish ambition will ever be gratified. I meant to try you. I hope to find you reasonable even if Darcy is not, but depend upon it I will carry my point. Chapter 3. A most loyal friend. Darcy met Elizabeth at the foot of the grand marble staircase. Unsettled by the dejected look in her eyes, he grasped Elizabeth's hand. Come with me, my love. Allow me to escort you to the parsonage house, away from all this turmoil. Elizabeth squeezed his hand, and seeing in her eyes a hint of her reviving spirits, he decided to lead her into the garden rather than straight to the path leading to the parsonage house. When they were seated next to each other on a bench, he said, You will be happy to know that Lady Catherine calmed down considerably by the time I left her. I believe the worst of it is over. He gently tucked a loosened lock of her dark hair behind her ear. How did you leave things with Anne? I'm afraid your cousin is determined to hold on to her hurt feelings. I'm sorry you were put in this situation. I feel sorry for her. I truly suppose she did not harbour the hope that you and she were destined for another. Did she bore you with an account of how we were fashioned for each other at birth? Said Darcy, in a voice eerily reminiscent of his Aunt Lady Catherine's. Mr. Darcy behaving ridiculously was enough to lighten Elizabeth's spirits considerably. Nodding, she mimicked the grand lady as well. It was the favourite wish of the gods. Darcy lifted Elizabeth's hand to his lips and kissed it. It's good we can laugh about it now, but the fact that our engagement is no longer a secret impacts our original plans considerably. Yes, I shall have to write to my father and tell him. And I must write to inform my sister. If it's any consolation, you should know she will be pleased. She has always wanted a sister. Here, Elizabeth's happy smile faded. What is the matter? Anne has promised to do all in her power to poison your family against me, starting with Miss Darcy. On what basis? She contends I'm no different than all the other scheming young women of your past who have attempted to use their arts and allurements to trap you. Pray do not give my cousin any mind. Clearly she is delusional. Elizabeth arched her brow. Darcy said, You are nothing at all like any other woman of my acquaintance. While I will not deny that you have bewitched me, body and soul, I would say your winning my heart is largely due to the liveliness of your mind. Ah, so my feminine arts and allurements played no part at all in your estimation? Here, Darcy reflected upon the first time he began to realise he was in danger of losing his heart to Elizabeth. Was it her teasing manner during her stay at Netherfield? Was it that mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner that made it difficult for her to affront anybody, even if she wished it? Her light and pleasing figure surely did her no harm. Unable to fix on the hour, or the spot, or the look, or the words which laid the foundation, the material point was that he was half in love with her before he even knew he had begun, and now she was his, and no man or any woman was ever going to come between them. Leaning forward, he brushed a kiss along the corner of her lips. He spoke softly in her ear. What do you think? It was late when Darcy said good night to Elizabeth at the parsonage gate. Feeling unequal to the prospect of an argument with her cousin, Elizabeth went straight to her room. Early the next morning, Elizabeth sat at the writing desk, composing a letter to her father telling him all that had happened. She had not got very far before a scratch at the door impeded her task. After waiting to be received, Charlotte walked into Elizabeth's room. Elizabeth said, "Good morning, dearest Charlotte. Have you come to help me pack my things?" Charlotte sat on the bed. "No, on the contrary. As I told her ladyship, you are my guest, and you are welcome to stay as long as you wish." "Bravo, although I don't imagine my cousin agrees with your hospitable sentiment." "No, he does not. However, you are not to concern yourself with all that. I came to congratulate you. I wish you and Mr. Darcy all the happiness you two so richly deserve. And speaking of richness, do you realise how rich you'll be? Now, Charlotte, you know none of that matters to me. Of course not, but that does not change the fact. Oh, dearest Eliza, it's just as I said it would be. Indeed, you always speculated aloud that Mr. Darcy held me in esteem. Now you must be honest with me and tell me that you felt it all along. I don't suppose there is any harm in confessing how much I wished it would be. You know perfectly well how much I have admired him since he first singled me out as his sole dance partner, beyond his immediate party at the Meryton Assembly. However, there was a time when I supposed you were equally enamoured of the dashing Lieutenant Wickham. Again, you know me better than most anyone. Both gentlemen from Derbyshire each had their own good qualities, but there was that shade in Wickham's character which bothered me more than just a little, and forced me to be guarded when in his presence. Do you mean when he attempted to poison your mind against Mr. Darcy? Indeed, although I would not allow him to go on, for I strongly suspected that anything he had to say against Mr. Darcy would be one-sided. There are two sides to every story, and although I strongly suspect Mr. Darcy does not care for the lieutenant, never once had he said anything about him to poison me against him. Then you have no idea what caused the two of them to be at odds with each other. I have not the faintest idea. As it can have nothing at all to do with me, I frankly don't care. I suppose it's for the best. Now let us not waste another minute discussing the dashing Mr. Wickham. Pray, now that your engagement to Mr. Darcy is no longer a secret, how do you plan to proceed as regards obtaining your father's consent? Actually, I was in the middle of writing to him. Mr. Darcy and I had looked forward to telling him after I returned to Longbourn, but now it seems I have no choice. Pray my missive reaches him before he receives the intelligence elsewhere. I know not but one person who would thwart your hopes in that regard. Lady Catherine? Indeed. Charlotte's face turned pensive. Oh dear. Whatever is the matter? Mr. Collins was up at the crack of dawn, and while I supposed he was composing this week's sermon, what if he were taking it upon himself to inform your father? Pray my cousin has not resorted to such stratagems. On the other hand, her ladyship did allude to being told of a dalliance between Mr. Darcy and me, without saying who had been her informant. Perhaps I have my cousin to thank for that as well. How would he have known? Well, when Mr. Darcy and I were preparing to part yesterday, we were standing together downstairs in the parlour, when we thought we heard the door closing. We owed it to our imaginations. It might easily have been Mr. Collins. Dearest Eliza, I wish I could say your suppositions were truly without foundation, but I'm afraid I cannot. You and I both know that my husband's unwavering loyalty to Lady Catherine would insist that he be the one to bring her the news. This brings me once again to the matter of my staying here. Again, you must not be bothered by any of that. Lady Catherine is his patron, but I'm his wife. She may have his ear during the day, but I dare say I have other parts of him during the night. Charlotte arched her brow. Need I say more? The thought of her friend and her cousin engaged in the act to which Charlotte alluded was beyond anything Elizabeth wished to contemplate. Suppressing her urge to shudder, Elizabeth said, Honestly, dear Charlotte, I would much rather you didn't. Richard waltzed into the room where Darcy sat drinking his coffee and reading a newspaper. After preparing his own cup of coffee, he took the seat opposite Darcy's. I had hoped to see you last night after her ladyship detained me. Where did you go off to? I waited for Elizabeth to conclude her business with Anne, and then I escorted her to the parsonage. Did your intended say how things went with our cousin? She would only say that Anne made it perfectly clear that she was opposed to the match. No surprises there. Anne is her mother's daughter. Frankly, I'm surprised. Never once did I suppose that Anne took any of her mother's foolishness to heart. Then you intend to speak with Anne as well. I'm obliged to do just that, especially as she has made it clear to Elizabeth that she intends to do everything in her power to poison the family against her, specifically mentioning Georgiana. Did Elizabeth tell you all this? She did. Granted, she didn't want to, for fear of causing a rift between Anne and me, but I could see how upset she was as a consequence of her visit with Anne, and I insisted she tell me all. Perhaps she simply didn't want you to fight her battles. I wager she's more than capable of standing up to anyone. But why should she have to, is my point. I don't intend to allow anyone to abuse my future wife. Richard took another sip, and after a moment he said, Then you may want to speak with Lady Catherine as well. Does your advice have to do with her purposes in detaining you last evening? Let me just say she made it perfectly clear that she will exercise extraordinary measures to see an end to your engagement. I trust you put her in her place. I tried to, but you know our aunt. She's not one to tolerate disappointment. Darcy pulled out his watch. I had hoped to call on Elizabeth as soon as it was a respectable hour, but I suppose that if she and I are to enjoy our remaining time here in Kent, I had better resolve these brewing tempests with Lady Catherine and Anne first. I had planned to accompany you to the parsonage house when you called on Miss Elizabeth this morning. If you do not object to my going ahead, I shall tell her that you have been detained. I should like that very much. Pray this business will be resolved shortly. Once Charlotte was gone, Elizabeth finished writing the letter to her father. She even wrote a letter to Jane, for what would have been the purpose in denying her sister's share of her joy now? After strictly instructing the Collinses' servant to post the letters that day, Elizabeth grabbed her bonnet, headed outside and set off for one of her favourite lanes. If she were lucky, she might meet Mr. Darcy, and rather than the two of them returning to the parsonage, they might enjoy each other's sole company for the best part of the day. Surely Charlotte wouldn't mind. She had not walked very far when, instead of being pleasantly surprised by Mr. Darcy, she saw on looking up that Colonel Fitzwilliam was meeting her. Forcing a smile to mask her disappointment, she said, "I didn't know that you ever walked this way." "I've been making a tour of the park," he replied, "and I intended to close it with a call at the parsonage. Would you mind if I walked with you?" "No, I should enjoy your company." Falling in step beside her, the Colonel said, "Our meeting was not by chance. Darcy told me how much you enjoy this particular path. I was hoping to see you." "Oh?" "Indeed. Darcy, you see, is detained at Rosings this morning. He asked me to tell you to expect him later this afternoon." "That was very generous of you to go out of your way in service to your cousin. You are a most loyal friend." "No more loyal than Darcy himself, but I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. May I be the first in my family to wish you proper felicitations." "Then you don't object to what your Aunt Lady Catherine and your cousin Anne deem the travesty of a lifetime?" "On the contrary." His assertion was met with pleasure, and soon Elizabeth's spirits rose to playfulness. I can well imagine many of Mr. Darcy's closest acquaintances who will be equally as aboard as her ladyship. "Do you speak of his acquaintances in general, or have you a specific person in mind?" "I was thinking of a Miss Caroline Bingley. If you know her, then you will know exactly of that which I speak." "I'm aware of who she is, having met her a time or two in town. Her brother is a pleasant gentlemanlike man. He's a great friend of Darcy's." "Oh, yes. Mr. Darcy is uncommonly kind to Mr. Bingley, and he takes a prodigious deal of care of him." "Care of him?" "Yes, I really believe Darcy does take care of him in those points where he most wants care. From something that he told me during our journey to Kent, I have reason to think Bingley very much indebted to him. However, I ought to beg his pardon, for I have no right to suppose that Bingley was the person whom Darcy meant. I'm merely speculating." "What is it you mean?" "Perhaps I have said too much, for it's a circumstance which Darcy would not wish to be generally known. If it were to get back to the lady's family, it would be an unpleasant thing. You may depend upon my not mentioning it. And remember that I have not much reason for supposing it to be Bingley." The Colonel's voice took on a furtive tone. Darcy congratulated himself on having saved a friend from the inconveniences of an imprudent marriage. He made no mention of names or any other particulars. "I only suspected it to be Bingley because he's the kind of man who is likely to find himself in that sort of scrape, and I know they were together the whole of last summer." Barely able to affect an air of indifference, Elizabeth sought to know more. When she asked if Mr. Darcy had given a reason for his interference, the Colonel went on to confide in Elizabeth all that Darcy had confided in him. Her heart swelling with indignation, Elizabeth couldn't wait to escape the Colonel's presence, in order that she might dwell on those things he had said that would surely cause her pain. Soon enough, she was once again in her room pacing the floor. How could he do it? Was it vanity that misled him? Was his abominable pride the cause of Jane's sufferings? What were the Colonel's exact words? I recall his saying there were some very strong objections against the lady. How can that possibly be? To Jane herself there could be no possibility of objection. She is all loveliness and goodness, her understanding excellent, her mind improved, and her manners captivating. Elizabeth's thoughts flew to her own situation. As he has offered his hand in marriage to me, neither can there be any objections to my family. When she thought of her mother and her 3 younger sisters, her confidence gave way a little. If he indeed suffers objections to my family, then what can be his design in marrying me? Surely he knows how much my family means to me, or does he mean to separate me from the people to whom I am most strongly attached? How excited she had been to share the news of her engagement with Jane. How wretched she now felt that the man who had been the means of causing her so much joy just yesterday was the same man who had been the means of destroying Jane's happiness, perhaps forever. The agitation and tears that the subject occasioned threatened to bring on a headache. This is no time for such recriminations. Mr. Darcy might be here any minute. She hurried to the window and looked outside. What am I to say to him that will not subject both of us to pain and misery of the acutest kind? Chapter 4. Understand his character. By now, Elizabeth was reading her most recently received letter from Jane again, looking for further confirmation of Jane's low spirits, and wearing a deeper path into the carpet, as well as decrying aloud what a terrible mistake she had made in accepting Darcy's hand. How could I have been so blind to his character? Do I even know this man? Charlotte tapped on Elizabeth's door and entered the room. My dear Eliza, I thought I heard someone moving about in here. I didn't expect to see you so soon. I supposed you and Mr. Darcy would be off doing what young lovers do on such a fine morning as this. Oh, Charlotte, I fear I have made a grave mistake. Charlotte rushed to Elizabeth's side. She placed her hand on her friend's shoulder and squeezed. Have you been crying? Did you and Mr. Darcy argue? Albeit too late now, seeking to hide her distress, Elizabeth dabbed her eyes. I never saw him. In fact, after what I've just learned, I'm not certain I ever wish to see him again. Her tone hesitant, Charlotte said, When we spoke this morning, you were the happiest woman alive. What on earth has happened since then? While walking along what had been one of our, Mr. Darcy's and my favourite lanes, foolishly hoping to see him, I came across the Colonel instead. What did he do? It's not so much what he did, but what he said and the manner in which he said it. Oh dear, I didn't think him so unfeeling as to share his Aunt Lady Catherine's and his cousin Mr. Berg's outrage over your engagement. No, on the contrary, he congratulated me. In seeking to sing Mr. Darcy's praises, the Colonel inadvertently gave me insights into his cousin's character, which had I known before, I would never have accepted his proposal of marriage. Here Charlotte looked away, no doubt concerned about her friend's propensity to reject marriage proposals that any other woman would jump at. Charlotte's nature would never allow her to say it, but Elizabeth was sure it was the direction in which her friend's thoughts tended. Charlotte placed her hand on Elizabeth's arm. Tell me what the Colonel said, if you will. He said Mr. Darcy boasted aloud that he had done everything in his power to separate Jane and Mr. Bingley. Charlotte's eyes opened wide and her mouth gaped. Even if such a thing were true, why would he come right out and say it to you of all people? Jane's own sister? He must have known it would cause trouble. That's the thing. He didn't mention Jane's name specifically, nor did he mention Bingley's. Rather, he said that his suppositions were based entirely upon the fact that Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley were together last summer. You and I know enough about the particulars to know he was speaking of his friend and my sister. Did he give a reason for Mr. Darcy's interference? Yes, he said there were strong objections to the woman's family. Mr. Darcy objects to my family. Yet he offered his hand in marriage to me. What can be his purposes? Perhaps he has had time to reconsider his opinion. What else can it be? A man like that does not change his mind so easily, not without sufficient encouragement. I'm persuaded he means to separate me from my family, the people who mean most to me. I shall not abide it, which is why I have no wish to see him. Eliza, you and he are engaged to be married. You must see him. Married? Now that I know the truth, do you truly believe I will be tempted to marry the man who has been the means of ruining the happiness of a most beloved sister? Charlotte embraced Elizabeth. I'm sorry you feel this way. Elizabeth's need to express her outrage over what Mr. Darcy had done was greater than her desire to be consoled. She stole away from the embrace. Had I not been so blinded by his manner of flattering my ego, I might have detected his fierce disapprobation of my family. I recall now how clearly disgusted he was when Mamma boasted to Lady Lucas, your mother, that there was to be a wedding at Netherfield even though Bingley had made no such offer to Jane. He likely mistook my mother's misspoken words as a reflection of Jane's character, and that is what led to the precipitous departure of the entire Netherfield party within days of the ball. Elizabeth hastened to her closet and retrieved her trunk. What are you doing? Charlotte, I must beg of you to send for a carriage. I must be away from Hunsford, far away from Mr. Darcy as soon as can be. You mustn't run away, not before you speak with Mr. Darcy. Her ladyship is very clever. What if this is all a vicious ruse? No, deep in my heart I know it's the truth. I want to see my sister. I want to be with Jane. If you insist upon leaving, then I cannot stop you. However, I urge you to think better of what you're doing. Mr. Darcy's callousness injured my sister. What else is there to think about? Resigned, Charlotte said, I suppose you have a point. I knew you would understand. I have but one other favour to ask, and it has to do with the fair. Charlotte held up her hand. Say no more. As fate would have it, Mr. Collins is planning to go to town, some urgent business on her ladyship's behalf. He is preparing as we speak. However, I expect the carriage will be here any moment by the speed in which he is gathering his things. Even the prospect of travelling 20 miles with her odious cousin was insufficient inducement for Elizabeth to change her mind and remain in proximity to Mr. Darcy. She tossed as many of her belongings into a single bag as she could. Fastening it shut, she said, I shall be in that carriage as well. Now that word of his engagement was out, he saw nothing at all untoward about arriving at the parsonage with a bouquet of fresh flowers he had gathered himself by hand. Even though he had every intention of showering his intended with jewels, he knew enough to suspect she would be just as pleased with this gesture. Darcy had been sitting in the parlour for quite a while, and he began to grow impatient. A casual observation of the mantel clock informed him it had not been 5 minutes. It seemed like a lifetime. He couldn't wait to see Elizabeth. His thoughts tended towards his earlier conversations with Lady Catherine and Anne. What a waste of time that had been with one parroting the other, both speaking of destiny and favourite wishes and other such nonsense. The worst part of it all was that they all were not even in the same room, for he had given Anne the courtesy of a private audience. How sorry he felt for his cousin, that she had persuaded herself to believe her mother's nonsense all those years, and as a result was on the verge of spinsterhood. Satisfied that he had made her understand that he would tolerate no interference from her in his future marital felicity, he supposed he would have an equal measure of success with his aunt. He didn't. At least he had extracted from her a promise that she would not badger the Collinses into reneging on Elizabeth's invitation to stay at the parsonage. Sooner or later he and Elizabeth would be in Hertfordshire with that awful family of hers. He would much rather it were later, in keeping with their original scheme. How he might endure such connections he had not a clue, but he was certain he would find a way for his dearest Elizabeth's sake. He glanced at the clock again. Why is it taking so long for her to come? No sooner did he finish his silent inquiry than the door opened. Darcy's face fell. Charlotte said, Mr. Darcy, by your expression you were not expecting to see me. I'm sorry to disappoint you. No, forgive me. It's just that I thought you might be Miss Elizabeth. I've been waiting. Here Charlotte interrupted him. Sir, I fear I'm the bearer of bad news. His heart slammed against his chest. Is Miss Elizabeth ill? Charlotte's eyes filled with unspoken apology. Eliza is not here. He inwardly exhaled. Do you mean to say she's out for a walk in the park? No, she's on her way to London. London? Has something happened to her family? No. Whatever reason would compel her to leave without first speaking to me of her plans other than a family crisis? Darcy pursed his lips. Is this my aunt's doing? Sir, although I'm loath to break my friend's confidence, I feel her reason for leaving is something you ought to know. Tell me at once. I will only say that Eliza and the Colonel were together this morning. They talked, and it was soon afterwards that Eliza decided to go away. If you wish to know more, you'll have to speak with him. Darcy quickly took his leave of the parsonage house. The tumult in his mind was great. How does one go from thinking himself the luckiest man in the world to the most ill-fated in the blink of an eye? He did not know which of the two to be angrier with, his intended or his cousin. What could Fitzwilliam possibly have said to upset her? More importantly, why did she leave without informing me of her plans? She had to know how unsettling I would find her rashness. Her impetuousness and her lively spirits were but two of the things that he was drawn to, but such behaviour as this was not something to be easily overlooked. Having accepted his proposal, she was as close to being his wife, his responsibility, as conceivable. Not long thereafter, Darcy stormed into the room. Looking up from his book, Colonel Fitzwilliam said, I didn't think we would have the pleasure of your company for hours. How did you leave Miss Elizabeth? She was not there. Darcy threw his cousin a hard stare. What on earth did you say to her? What do you mean she was not there? She and I enjoyed a pleasant stroll just this morning. Exactly, and whatever you discussed was enough to compel her to take her leave of Hunsford without allowing me the courtesy of a single word in explanation. Again, I ask you, what did the two of you discuss? Nothing out of the ordinary, I assure you. Think, man! Well, I wished her congratulations, of course. I recall singing your praises with an accounting of how you were a most loyal friend as evidenced by your good stewardship of Charles Bingley last summer. Bingley? Yes, you will recall informing me of how you had saved him from a most unfortunate alliance when you were together. You told Elizabeth that. What on earth were you thinking? She spoke of an acquaintance with his sisters. I had no reason to suppose any harm would come from her knowing how you helped save him from the appalling family you spoke of. How could you? Did you ever once consider that Elizabeth might know the young lady in question? She didn't say anything that would lead me to suspect she did. This is grave indeed. It's no wonder she left without seeing me. Wishing to see me, she likely despises me. I do recall her growing rather pensive as I related your coming to the service of your friend, but it's a far leap to suggest it affected her affection for you. For heaven's sake, man, the young woman from whom I saved my friend Bingley was Miss Jane Bennet, Elizabeth's eldest sister. This news sufficiently silenced Colonel Fitzwilliam for a moment or two. When he spoke, his voice was filled with contrition. Darcy, other than I'm sorry for speaking out of turn, I know not what to say. Darcy marched over to the side table and poured himself a drink. He threw it back in a single swallow and slammed the glass on the table. What must her opinion of me now be? Surely she will misinterpret my abhorrence towards her family as an indication of the strength of my regard for her. Darcy ran his fingers through his hair. He had spent so much time worrying about how he was to put aside all his apprehensions, about forming a serious attachment to her, owing to that family of hers. He never once considered what would happen if she learnt that acting on Bingley's behalf, he had prevented him from being trapped by a scheming mamma the likes of Mrs. Bennet. In so doing, he had been kinder to Bingley than he had to himself. It would have been so much simpler had his cousin kept his mouth shut. Colonel Fitzwilliam walked to where Darcy stood. Pray you believe me when I say that I never meant to cause trouble for you. Your intentions or lack thereof are of little consequence to me. My only concern is Elizabeth, what she must be thinking, and how she must be feeling. What do you plan to do now? What do you think I plan to do? I'm in love with her. Indeed, the depths of his desire for this woman consumed him. I cannot lose her, not when we are so close to being man and wife, but for this misunderstanding, I intend to do the only thing I can do. Chapter 5. Secret affairs to discuss. By the time the carriage pulled up in front of the gardener's home in Cheapside, Elizabeth was more than eager to flee her cousin's company. Hours of his effusive ramblings praising her for coming to her senses still rang in her ears, and even her frequent pretences of sleeping were insufficient to silence him. Only the sight of her dearest Jane had been enough to calm the tumult in her mind. When they were alone in the gardener's parlour, they embraced each other for a good long while. There was so much for Elizabeth to tell her sister. As they were the closest of sisters, who better than Jane knew how it pleased Elizabeth to be the lucky woman towards whom Mr. Darcy bestowed his handsome smiles? Though Jane might well understand the reason Elizabeth had accepted Mr. Darcy, she must never know the reason Elizabeth now questioned her decision. What good would Jane's knowing Mr. Darcy's role in her present discomfort serve other than to poison her against the man who might be her brother, should Elizabeth be forced to go through with the wedding? She was certain that if her parents didn't know already about her engagement, they would know as soon as her father received her letter. Her parents had been divided in their stance on the matter of her marrying Mr. Collins. Her mother had insisted that if Elizabeth did not marry him, she would never speak to Elizabeth again. Her father insisted that should Elizabeth marry Mr. Collins, then he would never speak to her again. Her father's opinion had prevailed, but what would be the chance her father would side with her again? Mr. Collins was no Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth was about to confide in her sister those things she felt at liberty to confide when her Aunt Mrs. Gardiner entered the room. By her expression, Elizabeth was the last person she expected to see. After a number of starts and stops in their attempts at making polite conversation, Mrs. Gardiner must have sensed the siblings' sombre mood. She said, "If you and Jane were in the middle of discussing secret affairs, I should be happy to take up my mending in another part of the house." Elizabeth said, "Actually, I would have you stay, for I was about to confide in Jane a matter that you ought to know as well. It has to do with my arriving from Hunsford earlier than planned." Elizabeth told her relations how she had accepted an offer of marriage from Mr. Darcy. At first the ladies had been astounded, but their astonishment was on the verge of giving way to joy when Elizabeth confessed to having made a grave mistake. Mrs. Gardiner said, "I admit to having a suspicion that you were fond of him, and I'm not unaware that he was most attentive towards you, but then he went away, and I thought that was the end of it. Indeed, I would never say I suffered his leave-taking with anything akin to a broken heart. However, when we renewed our acquaintance in Kent, the tender regard I suffered towards him rekindled into something more, at least I thought it had." "What happened in Hunsford to compel you first to say yes, and most importantly, what happened to give you cause for regret?" Elizabeth said, "I've been given to know about a serious defect in his character, which puts me in grave danger of an unhappy alliance should I go through with the wedding." "What, pray tell, have you discovered?" "Mr. Darcy does not like my family. He abhors my relations, and I fear he would have no qualms in separating me from all of you." "Not liking one's future in-laws is hardly a defect in one's character, although I suppose acting upon it is," said Mrs. Gardiner. "What evidence do you have that he would do such a thing as what you have suggested?" Elizabeth, not wanting to injure her sister's sensibilities, thought long and hard on what she might say. "Were I to marry him now, I fear it would be a marriage of convenience, and I know myself well enough to know I would never be happy in such a situation. Even if Pemberley is as beautiful as Caroline Bingley describes, what difference would any of that make if it were gained in exchange for my family?" Jane had taken up the habit of solitary rambles in the nearby park, likely as a means of placating her broken heart over Mr. Bingley's defection. Knowing how much she enjoyed her own solitary strolls, Elizabeth didn't press Jane to allow her to join her when she spoke of going out that morning. Hoping to see Jane at any moment, Elizabeth was sitting in the window seat overlooking the street when she saw Mr. Darcy's carriage approach. Intending to head him off outside, she jumped to her feet. Before she could don her coat and bonnet, a servant showed him into the room. He bowed. "Miss Elizabeth." "Mr. Darcy," she said, curtsying, "I'm surprised you have travelled all this way, and to Gracechurch Street no less." He must suppose a month's ablution is needed to cleanse himself from its impurities. "You are my bride. You left Hunsford without saying a word of your intentions to me. Where else would you expect me to be?" "No, I've begun to think better of my hasty acceptance of your hand, and as nothing is truly official, I feel safe in saying I made a mistake in accepting you." Darcy stepped closer to her. His urge to kiss her senseless was palpable. Even if they were not at odds, kissing her passionately would not be the thing to do. Soon. The possibility that he might never hold her in his arms or kiss her tantalizing lips was unthinkable. "You don't mean that?" She nodded. "Yes, I'm rather certain I do." "It's not so easy as that, and if you suppose it is, then you know nothing at all about me." "That is the thing, Mr. Darcy. After what I have learned, I feel I do not know you at all. How could you do it? My sister loves Mr. Bingley. Had you not interfered, the two of them would be happily married by now. Because of you, my sister is nursing a broken heart. You're upset, and I understand. However, I beg you to hear what I have to say." Now, standing directly in front of each other, Elizabeth's dark eyes shot daggers in his. "I'm more than upset. I'm furious." Here, Mrs. Gardiner entered the room and thus put an end to Darcy's and Elizabeth's heated discourse. If she did not see the tension that poured from the young lovers, she surely felt it. Casting aside her anger for the sake of civility, Elizabeth made the requisite introductions. Expecting to see Darcy's disdain, she witnessed his deference towards her aunt instead. Not that she was impressed. I know he can be exceedingly agreeable when he chooses to be. Mrs. Gardiner didn't stay very long, offering the excuse of attending to an urgent family matter upstairs. Not wanting to pick up exactly where they had left off earlier, Darcy said, "In my heart we are engaged. I shall not release you from the promises we made." "Then you refuse to believe me when I say I made a mistake in accepting your hand as quickly as I did." "You don't mean that." "Indeed I do. What do we even know about each other? I hardly know anything at all about you other than the irrefutable fact that you do not like my family. Who is to say I care about your family? If what I've seen is any indication, there is no telling how the rest of them comport themselves. I'm not sure I even want to know. I assure you they are nothing at all like Lady Catherine or Anne for that matter. Surely you find the Colonel beyond reproof. I recall the two of you got along swimmingly when you first met." Oh, and let's not forget how indebted I am to him. I believe his intentions were good." "Are you quite certain that he meant no harm?" "I'm not," Darcy said. "Have dinner with me this evening. I will invite my uncle and aunt as well as Georgiana. In fact, I shall extend the invitation to Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner myself." Elizabeth crossed her arms over her bosom. "Oddly enough, you made no mention of Jane." "Yes, of course, Miss Bennet is invited. What's more, I shall invite Charles Bingley." Chapter 6. Mistress of all this, Bingley sat up straight and tall in the finely appointed leather chair opposite his old friend. "Of course, I'll dine at Darcy House this evening, although I insist you give me some indication of what I am to expect," said Bingley in response to his friend's last-minute invitation. "Miss Bennet and Miss Elizabeth will be there." Bingley's astonishment was beyond expression. "Miss Bennet? Miss Elizabeth? I wasn't even aware of their being in town." "Miss Bennet and Miss Elizabeth are staying in Cheapside, with the aunt and uncle whose circumstances my sisters derided when we were in Hertfordshire, a Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, I believe." "Indeed? I find that hard to believe. You're telling me that Miss Bennet is in town?" Bingley sprang from his chair. "I must see her." Darcy could not say when he last saw his friend this enthusiastic, and he was further convinced that Bingley was as much in love with Elizabeth's eldest sister as ever before. If what Elizabeth said was true about her sister's feelings, and Darcy had no other evidence than to take Elizabeth at her word, then Bingley and Miss Bennet might be engaged by the end of the evening. As much as he did not truly believe such an alliance would be in Bingley's best interest as regarded elevating his rank in society, if that's what he wanted, then who was Darcy to object? Certainly my marriage to Elizabeth will provide the Bennet family as a whole much-needed connections such that even his sisters should have no cause to repine. The thought of Bingley's sisters and the measures they had taken to keep Bingley and Miss Bennet apart immediately came to mind. What a disaster it would be if they told Bingley what he had done. He already had his work cut out for him as far as earning Elizabeth's forgiveness. Did he dare risk Bingley's alienation as well? There was only one thing to do, to tell Bingley everything. After persuading his friend to resume his former attitude, Darcy stated his case. Bingley at first was silent as if in complete disbelief of all Darcy had confided. Calm words quickly grew heated, however, with Bingley's subsequent outrage over what Darcy had done. "How dare you interfere in my life to such a grievous extent? You, of all people, knew how much I adored Miss Bennet, how much I still adore her. I did it for your own good. Pray what has happened to compel you to put us in each other's paths now? Did you have some sort of epiphany while you were in Kent?" "In a manner of speaking, I did. I might as well tell you my surprise. You see, Miss Elizabeth and I, we are—" "You and Miss Elizabeth are what? Surely you do not mean to tell me you and she have reached an understanding?" "Actually, we have, or rather we had. It's rather complicated. I offered her my hand in marriage while we were in Kent, and she accepted." "You and Miss Elizabeth are engaged?" "At the moment we would best be described as estranged, but I mean to correct all that with this evening's dinner party." "Ah, so this invitation has nothing to do with your making amends to me for interfering in my life, but rather it has to do with placating Miss Elizabeth. Bingley, I wish you would not see it that way. Why are you even telling me all this? I wanted you to know the truth and hear it from me. Who else is privy to what took place?" "I would rather not say, for I believe there have been enough hurt feelings already, and although I do not expect you to forgive me so easily as all that, I do hope that you will trust me when I say that I'm trying to make amends. Earlier you said you and Miss Elizabeth are estranged. I take it she's not forgiven you." "As I said, our situation is complicated." "How so?" "Miss Elizabeth said she believes she acted too precipitously in accepting my offer of marriage, and now she has second thoughts." Mr. Darcy's household staff had outdone themselves in organising such a large dinner party in such a short span of time. In keeping with his promise to Elizabeth, he did not inform them that they were arranging the party in honour of their future mistress. Nor did he address her as such when he introduced her to all his family, much to his dismay. Despite her current misunderstanding with Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth was a little nervous over the prospect of meeting his sister, Miss Darcy. Once the formidable introduction took place, Elizabeth was astonished to see that her new acquaintance was as uncomfortable as she was herself. She had taught herself to believe that Miss Darcy was exceedingly proud, but the observation of a very few minutes convinced her that she was only exceedingly shy. Elizabeth was much relieved by all she discerned about the young lady who might possibly become her sister. The opportunity to meet Mr. Darcy's noble relations, the Earl of Matlock and his wife, Lord and Lady Edward Fitzwilliam, as well as their eldest son and his wife, Lord and Lady Robert Fitzwilliam, was indeed an honour for Elizabeth. She could easily say that the only thing these relations had in common with Lady Catherine was a strong family resemblance. She had expected to see the Colonel as well, but as his presence would have likely added to the evening's tension, she surmised Darcy had purposely excluded him from the party. If only the same could be said of Bingley's sisters, Mrs. Louisa Hurst and Miss Caroline Bingley. Elizabeth easily discerned that they were little impressed with her aunt and Uncle Gardiner, and their disdain in seeing their brother reunited with Jane was written all over their faces. Towards the Fitzwilliams, however, the spiteful sisters were all that was deferential, even to the point of sycophancy. Poor Miss Darcy was an even greater target of their unabashed adoration. Seeing them behave almost as badly as they did in Hertfordshire, Elizabeth silently amused herself throughout the evening over how disgusted they would be were they to discover that Mr. Darcy had offered her his hand in marriage. Indeed, that was one of the disadvantages of her explicit instructions to Mr. Darcy, that there would be no formal announcement of any sort of understanding that evening as a condition of her even being there. It didn't help that he escorted her to the formal dining room, when he might just as easily have escorted his sister. Elizabeth went along with his scheme, however. In truth, she was more than a little overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding her. The rich mahogany walls, the beautiful furnishings, lush carpeting and exquisite vases, all speaking not only to his wealth, but also to his excellent taste. To think it was within her power to one day be the mistress of all this. Looking around as if to make certain no one might overhear him, Darcy placed his hand over Elizabeth's hand resting on his arm, and spoke in a tender voice, intended solely for her pleasure. "I shall be more than happy to give you a private tour of the townhouse at your earliest convenience, my love." What a pleasure it was! His rich melodic voice, his warm breath against her skin almost threatened her resolve. Determined to resist his charms, Elizabeth said, "Sir, do you not suppose you're getting ahead of yourself? In such cases as this, I would refer you to my favourite philosophy." "Oh, and what is that, pray tell?" Leaning closer than the propriety of their current situation allowed, Darcy spoke softly in Elizabeth's ear. "Ask, and you shall receive." After dinner, Darcy and his guests gathered in the music room, and Miss Darcy exhibited on the pianoforte. Not having wanted to speak out of turn earlier in the evening, Lord Edward Fitzwilliam beckoned his nephew to the side. "I was rather surprised you didn't address Miss Elizabeth as you're intended." "You know?" "Did you suppose my son would keep such a thing to himself?" "Fitzwilliam," Darcy uttered aloud, his voice seething with annoyance. "I suppose not, thank you for your discretion. What on earth is going on between the two of you?" "Fitzwilliam and me? You know bloody well I'm asking about you and Miss Elizabeth." Darcy exhaled a frustrated breath. "My intended is entertaining the notion of ending our engagement." "Why, if I might ask?" "She is angry, nay, disappointed in me for my role in separating her eldest sister from Bingley when I persuaded him to leave Hertfordshire last autumn." His lordship diverted his eyes to where the aforementioned couple sat. "The two of them seem happy to be together this evening. Perhaps it will persuade Miss Elizabeth to show you a bit of leniency. I can only hope. I don't know what I would do were I to lose her completely." "Take heart. Perhaps we shall be celebrating a wedding in a matter of months, even weeks." Caroline Bingley, who happened to be passing by, nearly stumbled. "A wedding? To whom should I be wishing joy?" In a voice meant for her own entertainment, she said, "Pray, Mr. Darcy, have Miss Eliza's fine eyes finally persuaded you to do the unthinkable and offer her your hand in marriage?" Hoping against hope to avoid causing a spectacle, Darcy chose to remain silent. If only the same could be said for his uncle. Lord Matlock lowered his voice so as not to be overheard. "Nothing has been decided, but let me assure you that nothing would give me greater pleasure than the prospect of welcoming Miss Eliza and her fine eyes into the Fitzwilliam family." Chapter 7. All these temptations. Elizabeth wasn't wholly opposed to the idea of seeing Darcy that morning, which was really saying something when one considered that a few days ago he was the last person in the world she wished to see. She had to admit he was putting forth a valiant attempt to make up for his ill treatment of her sister. Jane's happiness at being reunited with Mr. Bingley rendered her giddy. Bingley had admitted to having known nothing of her being in town all that time. for surely if he had known, he would have made his way to her sooner. As for his leaving Hertfordshire in the first place, he owed it all to a severe misunderstanding of his intentions on the part of his family, and yes, even Mr. Darcy. Though words of love and marriage had yet to cross Bingley's lips, Jane felt certain it was simply a matter of time. Elizabeth and Jane had talked past midnight, and the dawn of a new day saw a resumption of where they had left off. Not wanting to see Elizabeth miss any more of the happiness that awaited her as the future Mrs. Darcy, Jane encouraged Elizabeth to let go of the disappointed hopes that precipitated her sister's current misunderstanding with Mr. Darcy. "Lizzie, you must admit that he was exceedingly kind and considerate of everyone last evening. He and Mr. Bingley are the best of friends. If they have not allowed this misunderstanding to impede their friendship, then why should I allow it to affect my feelings? You know I have always thought highly of Mr. Darcy. Then you are saying that you forgive Mr. Darcy?" "I'm saying I choose to believe him when he says he was acting in service of a friend." Tilting her head and loosening her golden hair, Jane said, "As I look back over the entirety of my relationship with Mr. Bingley, I can see how one who didn't know my character would have surmised that my heart had not been touched. Were one to accuse me of hiding my true feelings from everyone, I would confess to being guilty as charged. Here, Elizabeth was forced to consider her own behaviour over the entirety of her acquaintance with Mr. Darcy. As pleased as she was to be so admired by him, she didn't intend for him, or anyone else for that matter, to know the depth of her regard for this man. No one was going to accuse her of nursing a broken heart should her romantic musings over this man prove to be nothing more than the wistful imaginings of a girl in the throes of her first infatuation. It was enough for her to enjoy his attentions and even fancy herself in love with him, a man of consideration in the world who had the means of satisfying her every notion of what the perfect gentleman, the perfect husband really ought to be. Every one of their encounters held the promise of that which she longed for, the rousing sensation from the incidental touch of his hand, the excitement evoked when she caught him staring at her. Even the thrill of debating him and arguing opinions that were not always her own, merely in hopes of challenging him, excited her, for it always promised the chance to lose herself in his smouldering eyes and rich, melodic voice. What's more, being in his presence still engendered in her all those feelings. Now they were even more powerful. Incidental touches were nothing compared to the excitement of purposeful, lingering brushes of his fingers and most especially his soft lips upon her skin. If she didn't love him as much as she ought to by now, she was certainly over halfway there. Jane is exceedingly happy, and she bears no ill will towards Mr. Bingley or Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth reached for her pillow and then hugged it to her bosom. Is it not time for me to let go of my disappointment and seize my chance for happiness as well? Crumpling her brow, she bit her lower lip. Still, there's the matter of how Mr. Darcy regards the rest of my family. It's easy for him to show Jane and the Gardiners their due deference. Their understanding is exceptional, and their manners are beyond reproach. But what of the rest of my family? Placing the pillow aside, Elizabeth tossed off her bed covers and sat upright. It was time to get her day under way, as Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley had promised an early morning call, so they might all enjoy a stroll in the park. Soon enough Elizabeth and Jane would be returning to Hertfordshire. The gentleman had promised to do the same. Once I see how he behaves with my family, then I will truly know how to act. Thoughts of Hertfordshire gave rise to another matter that weighed on Elizabeth's mind. By now her father would have received her letter, informing him of all that had happened in Kent. If she knew anything at all about her mother, she was certain that all of Meryton knew it too. What bothered Elizabeth was her not knowing how her father had taken the news. In addition, she had urged Darcy not to travel to Hertfordshire to speak with Mr. Bennet personally, so long as there was this lingering uncertainty between them. Pray, I shall hear from my father soon. It was a pleasure dining with your aunt and uncle last evening, Darcy said, walking arm in arm with Elizabeth and trying to ignore the unspoken tension between them. Bingley and Jane walked just up ahead. They were much more animated. Elizabeth said, "Indeed. My aunt spoke of what a pleasure it was discussing shared accounts of Lambton, sir." Mrs. Gardiner had said a bit more than that, impressing upon Elizabeth her good opinion when saying there was something of dignity in his countenance that would not give one of us an unfavourable idea of his heart. "Your uncle and I spoke at length about his love of fishing, and I mentioned Pemberley's well-stocked lakes. He seemed very excited about the prospect of fishing there. I shall look forward to the Gardiners visiting us at Pemberley." "Do you truly mean that, Mr. Darcy?" "Of course I mean it. How can you ask me such a thing?" Darcy slowed his pace, compelling Elizabeth to do the same. "Do you imagine I would object to your family's visiting our home?" Elizabeth folded her arms over her bosom. "Did you suppose that your actions towards Jane and Bingley are insufficient cause for me to think as I do? I would be lying if I said that I did not immediately congratulate myself on the prospects of acquaintances whose connections were not so lofty as my own. I have been a selfish man all my life, in practice, though not in principle. As a child I was taught what was right, but I was not taught to correct my temper. I was given good principles but left to follow them in pride and conceit. Unfortunately, as an only son, and for many years an only child, I was spoiled by my parents. Though good themselves, they allowed, encouraged, almost taught me to be selfish and overbearing, to care for none beyond my own family circle, to think meanly of all the rest of the world, to wish at least to think meanly of their sense and worth compared with my own. I would like to think we have in us the capacity to change. Last evening was but the start. I promise you I will give you no cause to doubt the strength of my devotion to you, to us, ever again." Elizabeth said nothing in response to his ardent declaration, and thus he continued to try to reassure her. "You must give me the chance. Pray last evening cast aside any reservations you entertained about all my relatives being like Lady Catherine and Anne. I confess to being favourably impressed with your aunt and uncle. Georgiana is such a delightful young woman. It's no wonder Miss Bingley dotes on her." Darcy rolled his eyes. "Georgiana hates that, you know." Assuring Elizabeth that his sister's feelings towards her were in stark contrast to her feelings for Miss Bingley, he then told Elizabeth of Georgiana's delight in her acquaintance, especially after having heard so much about her in his letters. Despite her pleasure in finding in Miss Darcy a charming young woman who was just as eager to be pleased as Elizabeth was to be favourably received, Elizabeth was intrigued by Darcy's assertion. "I had no idea you were writing about me to your sister. What could have been your purpose?" "You speak as if you were completely unaware of how much I admired you even then. I always supposed that given the chance my sister would admire you as well, and she does. She looks forward to our nuptials, she proclaims you are everything a sister ought to be." Elizabeth smiled at this account of herself. With 4 sisters already, it was not as though she lacked practice. Elizabeth bit her lower lip as the thought of what sort of brother Darcy would be to her own sisters encroached upon her mind. He must have surmised as much. Darcy said, "Though I'm far less experienced than you as regards being a sibling, especially given the disparity in age between Georgiana and me, and the fact that she regards me as much a guardian as an older brother, I shall endeavour to be an excellent brother to your sisters as well. No doubt you would do the job admirably as regards Jane, who is all loveliness, but you have yet to spend any time at all with Mary and Kitty and Lydia. I fear what little time you did spend in their company taught you to think unfavourably of them. I don't deny it, but the truth is that it matters not what I think but how I act. Your sisters will become my sisters, and I will do everything in my power to protect them." A short while later the 2 couples entered the parlour and saw at once that Mrs. Gardiner had guests. There sat Mrs. Bennet, Miss Mary Bennet, Miss Kitty Bennet, and Miss Lydia Bennet, all garrulously adorned in a cornucopia of brightly coloured muslins and laces and bonnets. Mrs. Bennet sprang to her feet, hurried over, and embraced her second eldest daughter. "Oh, here you are, my sweetest Lizzie." She squeezed Elizabeth tighter. "How rich and how great you will be! What pin money, what jewels, what carriages you will have! Who would have thought it? I declare you are the luckiest woman in all of England." Remembering herself, she dropped her arms and straightened her attire. Turning to Darcy, she fashioned a deferential curtsy. "Mr. Darcy, it's my great pleasure to welcome you into our family." "Mamma!" Paying her daughter no mind and turning to Darcy's friend, Mrs. Bennet curtsied. "Mr. Bingley, it is a long time since you went away." Blushing, Bingley readily agreed to her assertion. "People say you mean to quit Netherfield entirely. However, I do hope that this good news about Mr. Darcy and my Lizzie will persuade you to change your mind." Looking at her eldest daughter, she said, "I'm certain my Jane will be exceedingly agreeable to such a pleasing prospect, will you not, my dear?" Jane lowered her eyes, likely to hide her embarrassment, but not Elizabeth. Darcy could feel her eyes boring into him. No doubt she aims to see how I endure her mother's unabashed effusions as well as her blatant matchmaking. Clearing his throat, Darcy said, "I do not wish to speak for my friend, but as for myself, I pray Bingley has every intention of accompanying me when I return to Hertfordshire." Darcy's announcement pleased Mrs. Bennet very well, and she made no pretence of masking her joy. Soon everyone was seated in the parlour. Darcy, however, did not have the pleasure of being seated next to Elizabeth, for her mother had ushered her to the part of the room where she sat. But he was close enough to see and hear all that was being said, and to suffer her increasing embarrassment as well. "Mamma," said Elizabeth, "what are you and my sisters doing in town?" "Why, where else would I be? As soon as I heard, I knew I had to come at once. There's so much to be done, what with the necessary preparations of settlements, new carriages, and wedding clothes. Although, I suppose your father shall take care of the former, and I'm sure Mr. Darcy has many fine carriages. Although, it is the thing to do to commission new carriages before the marriage, but I do not know that there will be time enough for all that, for it's my fondest wish that you and Mr. Darcy will be married by special licence. However, your father and I would be remiss as parents of the bride were we not to see that you have a proper wedding trousseau, and hence my purpose in being here." Elizabeth, who had been rendered speechless by all this, finally uttered, "Mamma." "Well, these things may not signify for you, but trust me, they are of utmost importance. We shall visit all the best warehouses while we remain in town, for what can be more urgent than your wedding clothes? There are things that must be ordered immediately." "Mamma, where is Papa? Did he also travel to town?" "Heavens, no, but you must not fret over that. Surely he will not object to such extravagance. It's not every day that one's favourite daughter marries a gentleman of £10,000 a year." Here, Elizabeth looked at the floor, but had she looked at Darcy, she would have seen that he bore her mother no ill will for her unabashed albeit impolitic enthusiasm. Where he had once been silently outraged when Mrs. Bennet boasted aloud of her eldest daughter's impending marriage to Bingley at supper, during the Netherfield ball, he now gave a silent prayer of gratitude that she was doing his bidding. Mrs. Bennet said, "Oh, I nearly forgot. I have a letter from your father." She reached into her reticule, retrieved it, and handed it to Elizabeth. Elizabeth accepted the missive and studied the penmanship, as if undecided whether to read it now or save it for later. "Well, do not keep us in suspense. You must read the letter now and tell us what he has to say. You know how your father enjoys vexing me. He would not mention a word of what he had to say to you, but I'm sure it's good news." "I suppose I'd better wait until our guests are no longer here." "Do not be silly. I insist you read it now." Mrs. Gardiner, who had been very quiet through all of this, said, "Lizzie, I should require your assistance in preparing tea for our guests. I'm certain Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley will not object to your absence." It was enough said to persuade Elizabeth to pardon herself from her company, and quit the room, her letter in hand, with her aunt. When they were alone, Elizabeth said, "How can I thank you for coming to my rescue? Think nothing of it, my dear. I could see that you are most anxious to know what your father has to say about all that has happened since you went away. Your uncle's study is unoccupied. You're welcome to read your father's missive in there." Following her aunt's advice, Elizabeth made her way to her uncle's study. What a relief it was to be away from her mother. She quickly pushed aside the hint of guilt she felt in leaving Darcy to fend for himself. As she reflected upon his behaviour in Kent whenever they were in company with his aunt Lady Catherine, she surmised he tolerated her mother's foolishness much the same as he bore his aunt's. Now that she had a basis for comparison for how he suffered the ridiculousness of others, calmly and with cool civility, she considered it had always been that way. Sitting on the sofa, she shook her head. Now I shall see what my father thinks of my situation in his letter. With sudden haste, Elizabeth quickly tore it open. "My dearest Lizzie, I confess that your letter came as no surprise to me. I have Mr. Collins to thank for robbing me of the privilege of receiving such life-changing news directly from you. You will not be surprised when I write of my first reaction to the following assertion. Your daughter Elizabeth has aspired no longer to bear the name of Bennet, and the chosen partner of her fate is one who may be reasonably looked up to as one of the most illustrious personages in this land. This young gentleman is blessed in a peculiar way with everything the heart of mortal can most desire: splendid property, noble kindred, and extensive patronage, and he is none other than Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy of Pemberley in Derbyshire. In spite of all these temptations, I must warn you of what evils you may incur should you fail to persuade my cousin Elizabeth to think better of what she has done, and indeed rescind her acceptance of Mr. Darcy's proposal. Such a generous consideration, I declare, is of utmost importance for his aunt, and my noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, does not look on the match with a friendly eye." Mr. Collins goes on, but I shall not burden you with any more of what he had to say. You, my dear child, cannot imagine how diverted I was upon having read these words, for nothing could persuade me of their veracity for the remainder of the day. Nothing indeed, until your own letter arrived, giving credence to our cousin's assertions. Mr. Darcy, who never looks at any woman but to see a blemish, and whom I had theretofore supposed never looked at you in his life, has offered you his hand in marriage, and you, my dearest Lizzie, write to say you have accepted." Elizabeth paused and reflected on her father's words. His wit she often admired, especially when directed at others. When directed towards her in such a manner, she found it rather less agreeable. However, in her father's defence she rightly understood his sentiments. Never did she let on to anyone other than Jane that she harboured a favourable opinion of the man whom most of the people of Meryton believed was haughty, and above his company. And never once did she consider that he and she might find themselves in such a position as this when he took his leave of Hertfordshire. Recalling her attention to her father's letter, she read on, "I would ask you if you were out of your senses to be accepting this man. However, I trust you to know what you are about. Pray your acceptance has nothing to do with his being so very rich, and everything to do with your liking this man, and most importantly your respecting him. I know your disposition, Lizzie. I know that you could be neither happy nor respectable unless you truly esteemed your husband, unless you looked up to him as a superior. Your lively talents would place you in the greatest danger in an unequal marriage. You could scarcely escape discredit and misery. My child, let me not have the grief of seeing you unable to respect your partner in life. With all that said, if it is indeed the case that you truly esteem this man, I give you my consent, and as he is the kind of man to whom one should never dare to refuse anything which he condescends to ask, I shall give him my consent as well. There you have it, my dear. I have little else to say other than I hope he knows how fortunate he is to have you." Her mind now relieved from such heavy weight, Elizabeth nearly lost track of the time she spent sitting there in quiet reflection. All at once a sharp frisson of panic struck her. "Mr. Darcy will think I abandoned him." Jumping to her feet, she folded the letter, tucked it into her pocket and headed for the door. What if Mamma's exuberance has given him cause to return to the sanctuary of his Grosvenor Square townhouse? She really did wish to spend some more time with Darcy before he took his leave, even though he was to dine with them at the gardener's home that evening. What if he has changed his mind? She threw the door open. Her mouth gaped. "Mr. Darcy." "Your aunt told me I might find you here." "I'm afraid I lost track of time. Are you taking your leave?" His countenance clouded with worry. "Should I?" "If you must," said Elizabeth, watching closely to how well he would react. His grave expression reminded her how much he did not like being teased. She quickly said, "Although the prospect of your leaving just now is one that I would find somewhat disheartening." Taking her hand in his, he squeezed it gently. "What does your father have to say?" Relieved by his smile, she stood on her toes and attempted to look over his shoulder. Surmising he was alone, she urged him inside the room and closed the door. Chapter 8. Hope for the future. His expression eager, Darcy said, "Pray tell me at once what your father has to say. What was the purpose of his letter? Has he given his consent?" Elizabeth said, "It would appear he has." He smiled in relief. "That is excellent news indeed. May I say that I am rather fond of your mother's ideas as regards special licenses? I do not doubt it, for it would mean that much less time you'll be forced to endure my Hertfordshire family's company. Darcy would have been lying if he denied the past quarter hour had been a formidable test of his endurance. What with the younger girls, Miss Kitty and Miss Lydia, repining about being in London when the militia was in Meryton. He was rather pleased when Miss Mary, who also made it clear she would much rather be in Meryton, openly opined that one of the benefits of being in London was that it afforded some distance between her younger sisters and their want of proper decorum often displayed with the officers of the local militia. Of course, the younger girls didn't see it that way at all, and thus ensued some rather exasperating bickering back and forth, their complaints about missing all the fun to be had with the officers, with no promise of an equal share of fun while they were in London, were insufficient to diminish Mrs. Bennet's enthusiasm for her second eldest daughter's impending marriage. She went so far as to proclaim there would be time enough for the younger girls to have their share of fun once she had seen to Elizabeth's speedy marriage to Mr. Darcy, and perhaps if she were lucky, Jane's subsequent marriage to Mr. Bingley. All this Darcy endured, thinking it was a small price to pay if it meant having Elizabeth as his wife, which was not to say he did not silently thank Mrs. Gardiner when she made her way to where he sat and told him where he might find Elizabeth. "I am forever in Mrs. Gardiner's debt." Darcy said, "Actually, that is not the reason. Just as I'm eager for us to be man and wife, I'm equally eager for us to begin our new life together as soon as can be. There will be plenty of time for us really to get to know each other after we're married, and what better place for that than Pemberley? I'm eager to show you Pemberley, not because I mean to impress you, but because I know you will love it there." He took her hand in his, and just in case I didn't make myself clear when we spoke on this topic earlier, I look forward to welcoming all your family to our home. Darcy laced his fingers through hers. "Think of it as an adventure, if you will, a wonderful, magical adventure, where we discover all there is to know about each other," he said, drawing her nearer, "as one." Amid the compelling combination of her father's consent, her mother's resolve, and Darcy's reassuring declaration, Elizabeth diverted her eyes in heartfelt reflection. Looking over to where she had been sitting on the sofa, she noticed a folded scrap of paper. As she hadn't noticed it before, she wondered if it might have fallen loose when she tore open her father's letter. She drifted over and picked it up. Darcy joined her. "What is this?" She tore her eyes away from the note and glanced up uncertainly at Darcy. "It looks to be a note from my father. I must have overlooked it earlier. Shall I give you a moment of privacy?" "No, I do not suppose that's necessary. I have no secrets from you." Throwing her eyes back to the piece of paper, she said, "Shall we read it together?" Darcy nodded, and Elizabeth unfolded it and started reading aloud. "My dearest Lizzie, I have but one thing to add to my letter, and this is it. Although I have given you my consent to marry your Mr. Darcy, my decree is not without conditions. I have it on good authority that nothing would please your mother more than to see you married by special license. 20-odd years of marriage have taught me how persuasive your dear mother can be, and thus I am obliged to tell you that so long as I have the honour of walking you down the aisle, I shall have no reason at all to repine, or simply stated, get yourself back to Longbourn as soon as you can." Elizabeth burst out in laughter, and Darcy did the same. After a moment, Darcy took both her hands in his, raised them to his lips, and brushed a light kiss atop her knuckles. Leaning in, Darcy rested his forehead atop hers. "Is this really happening?" She nodded. "Yes." Placing his hands about her long, slender neckline, he lifted her chin with his thumbs. Leaning closer still, their eyes met. Closing his, he brushed a gentle kiss upon her lips. An exquisite moment later, he said, "Well, my dearest, loveliest Elizabeth, what on earth are we waiting for? It seems our purposes are clear. First, let me procure a special license." His lips met hers once again, and he kissed her ever so tenderly and more intimately than ever before. "Then, let me get you back to Longbourn." Her sentiments in perfect harmony with his, Elizabeth released a warm and happy sigh. "I'm about to embark upon an adventure with one of the best men I know. And what an adventure it would be! One abounding with the promise of love and joy and wondrous hope for the future." Chapter 9. His Proposal. Gracechurch Street, London, 1812. The second reading of Mr. Bennet's letter, giving his favourite daughter his consent to wed along with his most ardent blessing, incited in Mr. Darcy and Miss Elizabeth an excitement and joy which neither wished to deny. He lifted her from the floor and, holding her tightly in his arms, spun around. This closeness unleashed their passions for each other, and their lips met as he lowered her to the edge of the desk. Purposely positioning their bodies just so, a violent expression of their desire for each other ensued. Elizabeth was so mesmerised by the touch of Mr. Darcy's lips on hers, and by his hands about her waist pulling her closer and closer, she almost forgot they were in her uncle Mr. Gardiner's study, mere moments away from one of her relations possibly barging into the room. Almost. Mr. Darcy must have felt the same, for he gradually lowered her to her feet. Both eased away, albeit reluctantly. Elizabeth missed him already, for kissing Mr. Darcy proved more pleasurable than even she had imagined. "Sir," she began, even as she savoured the lingering taste of his lips upon hers, "we ought to return to the others before we are missed." Leaning closer, Mr. Darcy brushed his lips against Elizabeth's one last time. "You're correct. However, if you will give me but a few minutes more, I have something that belongs to you." "You do?" Elizabeth asked, wondering what that might be. Mr. Darcy retrieved a royal blue velvet box from his pocket. Presenting it to his lady, he opened it for her inspection. I have wanted to give you this for days." The brilliant diamond ring inside took Elizabeth's breath away. "Sir, it is stunning. My father presented it to my mother when she accepted his proposal, and now I present it to you." He retrieved the ring and slipped it on Elizabeth's finger. "It is a perfect fit, just as I knew it would be." He raised her hand to his lips and bestowed a lingering kiss. "Just as you and I are a perfect fit. You complete me, my love. From this day forward, I never wish to be parted from you again." Every inquiring eye fell upon Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth when they entered the room. Having tidied her hair and gown, as well as aided her, intended to the extent their circumstances called for, Elizabeth hoped their appearance bore no evidence of the liberties she had allowed while alone with the gentleman. "My dearest Lizzie," cried Mrs. Bennet, hurrying to where the young lovers stood, "where on earth did you run off to?" She directed her speech to Mr. Darcy. "Oh, thank goodness you found her, or I shall have gone completely distracted." Assured that their appearance was the last thing on her mother's mind, Elizabeth silently exhaled. Mrs. Bennet continued, "Why, I almost feared she'd run away to avoid your proposal. It would not have been the first time she acted so precipitously against her better interests." "Mamma!" Elizabeth exclaimed. Talk of her refusal of another man's hand in marriage was the last thing in the world to bring up at such a time. The lady returned her eyes to Elizabeth. "Oh, but you are here now, which is all that really matters." "Mamma, I did not leave, and nor did I intend to," Elizabeth replied. "I simply took the opportunity to read Papa's letter in privacy." She threw a furtive look of gratitude at her Aunt Mrs. Gardiner, not only for suggesting Elizabeth steal away to Mr. Gardiner's study, but also for hinting to Mr. Darcy that he might find her there. Mrs. Bennet's eyes opened wide. "Well, child, do not keep us in suspense. What does your excellent father have to say? Has he given you his blessing?" Smiling, Elizabeth nodded. "Papa has given his heartfelt consent." She held up her left hand so everyone in the room might see her diamond ring. "Mr. Darcy and I are engaged. We're getting married." The excitement which Elizabeth's announcement inspired in her mother, her sisters, her aunt, and even Mr. Bingley, was everything that could be expected upon hearing such happy news, and included eager proclamations which Elizabeth would rather wish her intended had not heard. Mrs. Bennet started clapping her hands gleefully, celebrating her own good fortune. As if the gentleman was not standing there, she happily proclaimed, "Oh, my sweetest Lizzie, how rich and great you will be! What pin money you shall have, for he has £10,000 a year." The youngest of the Bennet daughters, Lydia was a stout, well-grown girl of 15, with a fine complexion and good-humoured countenance. Her wild animal spirits ideally suited her determination to leave her own unique mark on the world. Her mother's favourite by far, she was just as eager to find herself a husband as her mother was determined to find her one, preferably a tall, handsome gentleman in a red coat. Picking up where her mother's exultation ceased, she exclaimed, "Oh, he is so very rich, and you shall have such fine clothes and exquisite jewels so far as the eyes can see." Her arms outstretched, she spun herself around. "Why, if only he were an officer, I would be so very jealous of you, Lizzie." The fourth Bennet daughter, Catherine, suffered a rather accommodating nature, which notably manifested itself in a less than desirable way so far as her younger sister Lydia was concerned. Affectionately known as Kitty among her family and friends, she echoed her sister's sentiments and further added, "That is to say nothing of the magnificent balls you shall have, putting the rest of us in the path of many rich men." Try as she might to suffer her family's antics with every appearance of composure, Elizabeth coloured. "Surely Mr. Darcy believes we are the most mercenary lot he has ever had the misfortune of knowing." A sidelong glance at her intended gave her to know she had nothing to fear, for he only had eyes for her, eyes filled with love. The character of the third Bennet daughter, Mary, relied upon strict adherence to propriety. To her, the appearance of accomplishment and knowledge was everything, to the point of deceiving herself of her own true feelings. As it was her turn to speak, she chose her words with some care. What are fine clothes, fine carriages, expensive jewels, and crowded balls in the grand scheme of things? Pausing her speech, she pushed her spectacles closer to her eyes. "Balls, especially," she continued. "They are nothing in comparison to good conversation and reading. I have heard it said that Pemberley boasts of having the finest library in all of Derbyshire." With that said, Some semblance of a smile reached her mouth. "I think I shall love to come to visit you with alacrity." Jane's exuberance, though warm, was somewhat more subdued in keeping with her character. "I am so happy for you, Lizzie." Amid the ongoing outpouring of felicitations from the others among themselves, she whispered in her sister's ear, "I have always thought very favourably of your Mr. Darcy. I do not know that I have ever met a more perfect match for you." The sisters embraced. As for the others in the room, Mrs. Gardiner and Mr. Bingley, the happy smiles that diffused over their faces confirmed their joy. Seeing this in the latter of the two, Elizabeth clung to her sister a little longer, and wished with all her heart that Jane too would soon know such happiness. While the two younger sisters continued to flutter about the room, Mrs. Bennet retrieved a crumbled linen cloth from her pocket and used it to fan her face as a means of calming herself. Breathlessly she said, "You must be married by special licence." Pausing long enough to catch her breath, she continued, "Why, Mr. Darcy is as good as a lord. No doubt his family will expect nothing less." She looked at the gentleman intently. "Pray, we shall soon have the opportunity to meet your relations. From all that I have been told about your aunt, the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, no doubt it will be a great honour for us all. Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet's cousin, boasts incessantly about her ladyship's benevolence and her goodness. I can only suppose Lord and Lady Matlock will be equally agreeable." She pursed her lips. "Although it is entirely possible that they may indeed be the complete opposite, I suppose. But then again, what do I know? I thought you hated my Lizzie. That you hated all of us, in fact, and now look at the two of you, engaged to be married. Who would have thought such a thing possible?" "Mamma," Elizabeth cried. How she wished her mother would hold her tongue. While it was true that Mr. Darcy had often been accused of being haughty, arrogant, and above his company, while in Hertfordshire several months prior, he had never really displayed any such antipathy towards Elizabeth. Toward her mother, he may have been rather less cordial than his amiable friend Mr. Bingley was. Seeing my mother's behaviour now, I can hardly find fault in his having felt that way. Mr. Darcy, with grave propriety, said, "I must beg your forgiveness, madam, for any ill will my behaviour may have caused when we first met. You must allow me to make amends." "How kind and considerate you are, sir," Mrs. Bennet replied in a conciliatory tone and one laced with approbation. "Of course, all is forgiven, and I would hope that you will forgive my own rush to judgment where your relations are concerned, for I shall be pleased to meet them." Mrs. Bennet's words drew Elizabeth's mind to the day in Kent when Mr. Darcy first offered his hand in marriage, and they later visited Rosings to have tea with his aunt Lady Catherine de Bourgh and his cousin Miss Anne de Bourgh. Try as she might to forget either lady's hurtful words, they were as fresh in her memory as the day they were spoken. Seeing how the news had upset Mr. Burr, Elizabeth had set off to explain the matter to the aggrieved young woman, only to be halted by her ladyship. "Explain? Explain?" Lady Catherine had furiously questioned. "You mean to explain to her how the pretensions of an upstart like yourself have been the means of thwarting the favourite wishes of her dearest aunt, Darcy's own mother, my own sister, Lady Anne, that my Anne and Darcy should be united in wedlock, while in their cradles we planned their union." Mr. Bourgh's willingness to listen to Elizabeth had been no better. "This union will not be ordained by anyone in the Fitzwilliam family, not even by Georgiana," the other woman had threatened. "By your earlier assertion, you have yet to meet her. By the time I've told her about you, you will not wish to meet her." Elizabeth shuddered amid this recollection. She had taught herself to believe the de Bourghs were alone in their staunch opposition to the union. Having met the Fitzwilliams as well as Miss Darcy on the night she dined at Darcy House, she had detected no hint of their disapprobation toward Jane or herself. Of course I had not been presented to Miss Darcy as her future sister, or to Lord and Lady Matlock as their future niece. Have I cause for concern as Mr. Bourgh forewarned, or am I merely worrying for naught? Wanting to dissuade her mother from any further talk on the matter, Elizabeth said, "Mamma, I am sure we cannot impose on the Fitzwilliams with such short notice. They are very prominent people, and this is a hectic time of year. As we will all be at Longbourn in a matter of hours, there is no time to meet anyone. Besides, there will be time enough to meet Mr. Darcy's family after the wedding." "Nonsense!" the lady exclaimed with energy. "Acquiring a special licence will surely require more than a few hours. It will probably take days, if not weeks. With all that there is to be done to order your wedding clothes and the likes, there is no reason at all to leave town." "Oh, mamma!" cried Lydia. "Wouldn't it be wonderful if Lizzie's wedding were to be held here in town at St. Paul's Cathedral? Oh, Our neighbours and friends at home will be exceedingly envious, will they not? Oh, do let us have a wedding here in town." Chapter 10. A delightful scheme. I do not see why Mr. Darcy and Lizzie cannot be married at St. Paul's as easily as in the church in Meryton, but that must be their decision, said Mrs. Bennet, her voice affecting dispassion. Leave it to the youngest Bennet daughter, Lydia, to handle a delicate situation so indelicately. Judging by the haste in which Mrs. Bennet echoed the idea, she likely had secretly entertained the notion herself. Any wonder Lydia was her mother's favourite. Their minds were so similar. Mrs. Bennet looked at Darcy. "Sir, I am sure it will mean the world to my daughter to be married in such an auspicious place as St. Paul's Cathedral. Do you not agree?" He gave a slight nod. "I am happy to marry your daughter anywhere she pleases. I defer to her, for a happy bride is the surest ingredient for a happy wedding." The gentleman's words were like music to the lady's ears. Her face beamed with pleasure. "Then it is settled," Mrs. Bennet responded. "Lizzie shall be married here in town." "Mamma," Elizabeth cried, "what possible objection can you have to such a charming scheme, Lizzie? Surely Mr. Darcy's family would expect nothing less," cried Mrs. Bennet impatiently. "Papa hates town. In fact, in his letter he expressly urged me to return to Hertfordshire as soon as could be." Mrs. Bennet dismissively waved the crumpled handkerchief in her hand. "You must leave your father to me, Lizzie. Surely he would not wish to deny you such a pleasing prospect as a wedding at St. Paul's, and in a manner suitable for the future wife of a gentleman of Mr. Darcy's stature. Your Mr. Darcy has £10,000 a year, and likely more, for I have heard it said he owns half of Derbyshire. If looks alone had the power of silencing one's speech, Elizabeth would not have suffered such mortification. How could her intended be anything other than offended by her mother's mercenary words? "Mamma," Elizabeth exclaimed with energy. Being a woman of mean understanding, little information and uncertain temper, subtlety was not Mrs. Bennet's strong suit. "You need not worry about a single thing, Lizzie," she replied to her daughter's outburst. "I shall see to every detail of your wedding and the wedding breakfast too, of course. Why, it must be held at your house here in town, Mr. Darcy. Pray you do not object to such a delightful scheme." "Consider my home as your home," Mr. Darcy said. "Oh, what a perfect gentleman you are, Mr. Darcy. My Lizzie is the luckiest girl in all of England. Oh, I knew she could not be so clever for nothing." "Now," she began, "the only thing that remains to be settled is the matter of our living arrangements in the interim. It will hardly be feasible for all of us to travel back and forth between Longbourn and town, what with all that needs to be done and with time being of the essence." Interrupting her mother's speech, Elizabeth said, "Which is even more reason to keep things simple and return to Longbourn." "But the 6 of us are already here in town. As we're all here at the gardener's, the only one who really needs to be inconvenienced is your father. Surely you must consider the inconvenience to Uncle and Aunt Gardner caused by the addition of so many guests, unexpected guests at that." Mrs. Bennet peered at Mrs. Gardner, who had remained a silent witness to the thickening wedding plot. "What say you, sister?" An elegant woman who was several years younger than her sister-in-law, and leagues ahead of her in terms of sense and sensibility, Mrs. Gardner replied, "I am sure your brother and I will do our best to see to everyone's comfort." Lydia exclaimed, "La, mamma, did you not hear Mr. Darcy say his home is our home? Why should we not all stay at his townhouse? No doubt it is very large and very grand too." Kitty lifted her skirt just so and commenced dancing about the room. "We may even be invited to elegant soirees and society balls. The balls at home are nothing compared to the balls in town, I am sure." "Lydia," Elizabeth said, "you cannot invite yourself to another person's home." "Lizzie, how can you be so selfish?" Lydia asked. "If Mr. Darcy does not object, then why should you?" "Selfish?" Having likely heard enough, Mr. Darcy said, Mrs. Bennet, if you give me leave to have a private audience with Miss Elizabeth, my lovely bride, I shall be in your debt." "You're welcome to talk in privacy in Mr. Gardner's study," Mrs. Gardner said in compassion to the young lover's plight. With that said, Darcy and Elizabeth were gone directly. When they were alone behind closed doors, Elizabeth released a frustrated breath. "Welcome to my life, Mr. Darcy." He took his intended in his arms. Their lips met. Gently he coaxed Elizabeth's lips apart, ran the tip of his tongue inside, and for a moment or two it seemed they were the only people in the world. Oh, the power of his kiss to lift her spirits. Their lips parted, he gazed into her eyes. "There is no place else I would rather be." The agony she had suffered in the parlour now all but faded, Elizabeth said, "Are you certain? It is not too late to change your mind." With some reluctance she eased away. "Save yourself while there is still time." "Never," he said. "Your family's excited about our wedding. I can only wish for a fraction of such exuberance on my own family's part. You're fortunate in that regard. Besides, I can think of far worse things than spending the next few weeks or so under the same roof with you, night after night." He drew Elizabeth once again into his embrace. "After night." He brushed his lips against hers, once the rest of the household has settled, silent footsteps away. More aroused by his conjecture than she cared to confess, Elizabeth said, "Indeed, having my dear mother close by." "Well, there is that." Still holding her in his arms, he whispered softly in Elizabeth's ear, "With a bit of ingenuity on our parts, I believe we shall persevere." Her spirits rising to playfulness, Elizabeth said, "Perhaps I ought to remain here in Cheapside while the rest of my family reside at Darcy House." "You would not dare?" "Leave you alone with my mother and my younger sisters. I love you too much to subject you to such a fate." "You love me, Elizabeth?" Mr. Darcy asked, taking her somewhat aback. Smiling a little, she nodded. "Do you really need to ask?" "Given how we parted in Kent and the events leading up to this very day, I must confess to having suffered a bit of concern. I suppose I might have handled things more sensibly, and I will do my best to behave with more thought than emotion going forward. The fact is, I can scarcely recall a time that I did not love you, Mr. Darcy. I love you with all my heart and soul." Darcy and Elizabeth sealed her ardent declaration as warmly and sensibly as could be expected, until a general awareness of their surroundings drew them apart. "Elizabeth, my love, why not allow your family to have this time? Soon enough, we shall be man and wife, happily secluded far, far away from everyone at Pemberley for an indeterminate amount of time, and making such happy memories as to render the next few weeks or so inconsequential. If this is what is required to bring your mother and sisters a modicum of satisfaction, I say so be it. Our happiness is assured." Gently retaking her lips, he drew her into a lingering sweet kiss. Soon enough, he added, "Of course, as it is my mission in life to deny you nothing that is within my power to bestow, I shall defer the final word on all such matters pertaining to our wedding to you." Chapter 11. Elevated Standing. News of any type travelled fast in a community as intimate as Meryton and its surrounding villages. Especially news that the brightest jewel of the country, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, was engaged to be married to the gentleman from Derbyshire who had £10,000 a year and reportedly owned half that county. In this case, Mrs. Agatha Phillips heard it directly from her sister, Mrs. Bennet, who wrote a letter boasting that the wedding was to take place in London and inviting her to share the blessed occasion, along with the rest of the family. How could Mrs. Phillips refuse? Theirs was not a large family. One of only 3 Gardner siblings, the other 2 being her sister Fanny and her brother Edward. Agatha was the only one to remain childless. She liked to think of her sister's daughters as the closest things to being daughters of her own, owing to their proximity at Longbourn village, where she visited with some regularity. Her brother's children she barely knew. What with their home being so far away in town, it did not escape her that her Longbourn nieces considered their brother's wife as their favourite aunt. But what was there to be done? Agatha supposed she would have been their favourite if she were half so generous as her sister-in-law, what with her wont to bring them gifts whenever she visited from town, along with talk of the latest London fashions. Of all her nieces, Kitty and Lydia were her particular favourites, and she was always delighted to receive the girls when they ventured to Meryton. What a balm Kitty and Lydia were for the pangs of her own disappointment in not having children of her own, and of these 2, Lydia was her favourite. With great fondness, she thought of Lydia as a younger version of herself. No doubt her sister Fanny felt that same way. Like mother, like daughter, her sister always posited. Agatha knew better. Like aunt, like niece aptly described her sentiments on the matter. With Lydia being Agatha's favourite, it must be no surprise that Elizabeth was her least favourite. Regarding what mattered most to her, the 2 nieces were as opposite as night and day. The second Bennet daughter was too much like her father, Thomas Bennet, for Agatha's liking, always laughing at others whom they perceived as their lessers. It does not surprise me one bit that Miss Lizzie's caught the eye of the haughty Mr. Darcy. In essentials, those 2 are very much alike, for he always supposed he was above his company when here in Hertfordshire. From the first moment of their acquaintance, he only had eyes for Lizzie, whereas he barely tolerated any of the rest of us, especially my sister Bennet. Indeed, she recalled how much her sister always disliked Mr. Darcy, owing to his general disdain for the people in Hertfordshire and his particular abhorrence toward her sister, as evidenced the night of the Netherfield ball when he overheard her boasting of an imminent wedding between her eldest daughter Jane and his friend Charles Bingley. I can only imagine how he tolerates my sister now, given that she is to be his mother-in-law and she's currently staying in his London home. I, for one, can hardly wait to bear witness to it all. Mrs. Phillips's wonderment about the news from London was shared by others as well. Indeed, Mr. Darcy's former friend and now worst enemy, Mr. George Wickham, had also heard the news. He heard it from his friend and fellow officer in the militia, Mr. Denny, who heard it directly from Mrs. Phillips, who had yelled it out to him from her apartment when he was passing by on the street below one day. Mr. Wickham did not know quite what to make of this news, for he knew his former friend to be arrogant and haughty, far too proud to marry someone whom the gentleman's aristocrat family and society in general might consider unworthy. On the other hand, he could not be too surprised after seeing how much the charming young lady had affected Darcy when they were all together in Hertfordshire last autumn. I tried in every way I knew to poison the young lady's mind against that miserly Darcy, but she would not be deterred. Surely she does not love him. How could she? Regardless of how wealthy he is, he did not tolerate her family. Other than herself, no one in the neighbourhood thought much of him. I always supposed Miss Elizabeth was a staunch protector of her family and her loyalty to them, unshakable. He scoffed. Family loyalty is a second-hand emotion when a large fortune is at stake, he spoke aloud, albeit to no one in particular. George Wickham grinned. I always did suppose Miss Elizabeth was clever. She knew her power over Darcy, and she used it to her particular advantage. It will not surprise me one bit if a Darcy heir is being welcomed to the world in under 9 months. What a clever young woman indeed. Now I understand her lovely sisters have all gone to London and are staying at Darcy House, while wedding preparations, no doubt, the likes of which are meant for royalty, are under way. The youngest Bennet daughter, what was her name? Ah, Lydia. That little minx always did show a preference for me, and one which I had no reason to think twice about. That is, until now. I've meant to travel to London for a while. I think the time has finally come to make that trip to London that I've been putting off for so long. Days hence, the ladies of Longbourn as well as Mr. Bennet were all settled at Darcy House. At first, Mrs. Bennet had insisted that all her daughters should have new attire more suited to their high standing and lofty connections. Mr. Bennet, however, had prevailed by having the housekeeper Hill oversee the packing of his wife's wardrobe as well as his 3 youngest daughters, and had seen to it that they were sent to London straight away, his argument being that they were not made of money despite his second eldest daughter's good fortune. Her husband's financial lamentations aside, Mrs. Bennet was resolute that no expense should be spared where Elizabeth's wedding clothes were concerned. In this she won out even if her daughter objected. What did Elizabeth know about such things was her favourite complaint. Only she knew all the best warehouses, only she knew all the ins and outs of preparing for her daughter's wedding to Mr. Darcy. Mindful of her talk with Mr. Darcy to allow her mother to have her fill with wedding-planning joy, Elizabeth tried as best she could to suffer her mother and younger sister's antics with composure, a task made increasingly more challenging with each passing day as her youngest siblings grew more and more comfortable with their elevated standing. Kitty and Lydia often walked to Meryton when at home to replace the monotony with the latest gossip as well as to patronise the local merchants. As Darcy's house guests, they readily availed themselves to one of his luxury carriages with servants aplenty to carry their purchases from various shops. On that particular day, while shopping in Mayfair, the two were delighted to espy a couple of familiar faces among the crowded street. Lydia threw open the window. "Oh, Mr. Wickham! Mr. Wickham!" Kitty, ever taking her cues from Lydia, likewise did the same, and now there were 2 young ladies, dainty handkerchiefs in hand, their heads outside the carriage window, their arms flailing all about, and creating quite the spectacle in their quest to summon the officers. Mr. Wickham, Mr. Denny. No doubt startled, the gentleman turned in the direction of the carriage. The eager young ladies banged on the carriage roof to command the driver to stop right there in the middle of the street. When at last the carriage halted, the 2 ladies escaped the carriage and raced to the part of the street where their Hertfordshire acquaintances stood. After greeting one another in the usual way and expressing their surprise in meeting in London, of all places, Lydia could not help but opine to her favourite of the two men. Pouting a little, she cried, "Oh, Mr. Wickham, I ought to be very vexed with you for all but abandoning us while you were courting Mary King. I always thought she was a nasty, freckled little thing, and not nearly so worthy of you as she ought to have been. But now that she has gone off to Liverpool, hopefully never to return, I believe I can be persuaded to forgive you. Pray that you will forgive me, Miss Lydia, for I should never wish to live in a world in which I suffered your disapprobation." Kitty started giggling, but ceased when her sister nudged her with an elbow. "Earning my forgiveness shall not be so easily attained as uttering a few flattering words, sir. I assure you," Lydia said, batting her eyes. "Tell me what is to be done, and I shall see to it that it is indeed done. Your wish is my command. Trust me, sir, I shall hold you to your promise." "I certainly hope you will," he said, taking Lydia by her hand and bestowing upon it a lingering kiss. Their eyes met. "I depend upon it," the gentleman murmured. A wave of excitement flooded young Lydia's being. She had always wished to be the lucky recipient of such affection from a charming gentleman in a red coat. Standing before her, gazing into her eyes, and still holding her hand, was the most handsome officer of her acquaintance. Wickham had all the best parts of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and a very pleasing address, and for the first time he only had eyes for her. Mary King is a fool to have walked away from such a man. Why? I would give most everything in the world to be courted by Mr. Wickham. "La!" she cried, when at length he released her hand. "I am sure Mary King's loss is our gain." They had not been standing and talking for long before Kitty espied another familiar face. Lady Matlock was directly across the street. The grande dame had just exited a modiste, and was being handed into her carriage. "Oh, your ladyship!" Kitty shouted, jumping up and down and thus drawing the attention of a good number of elegant ladies and gentlemen standing nearby. This her younger sister noticed. She too called out to the noble dame. "Lady Matlock," she exclaimed while lacing her arms, through Mr. Wickham's as well as Mr. Denny's. Seeing her ladyship looking her way, Lydia yelled, "These are our friends from Meryton. They are officers in the militia. You must invite them to dine with us all at Matlock House very soon. They are excellent company." Whether Lady Matlock heard Lydia's pleas the latter could not say, for the former boarded her carriage with neither a single word nor gesture. When the golden silk curtains that had been open were swiftly drawn, Lydia had her answer. Even someone as wild-spirited as Lydia could not be completely unaffected by such a cut. Her ladyship had to have noticed the Darcy carriage bearing a crest not too dissimilar in design from her own carriage's larger crest waiting just ahead. Lady Matlock had to have discerned who she and Kitty were. "Why, I never!" Lydia exclaimed with energy before returning her attention to the two gentlemen beside her. "Pardon," said Wickham when he could. "Are you acquainted with Lady Matlock, Miss Lydia?" "La!" she cried. "Have you not heard the happy news, Mr. Wickham?" Before he could fashion a response that did not belie his evident knowledge, Kitty burst into a peal of giggles. "Lizzie is engaged to be married to her ladyship's nephew, Mr. Darcy." Of course he knew. His friend Denny also knew. Everyone in Hertfordshire knew. Denny was about to say something, but a stern look from Wickham silenced him. Although Wickham had allowed Denny to come to London with him, he had not said a word about the spur-of-the-moment excursion having anything at all to do with Fitzwilliam Darcy. Denny, as it turned out, had official business in town. He had no reason to suppose that Wickham did not. Denny also knew how much Wickham despised Darcy, for his friend had often complained of being ill-used and denied the manner of living that ought to have been his when Darcy ignored his father's, Wickham's godfather's, last will and testament. What Denny did not know, however, was the lengths to which Wickham would go to exact an act of fitting revenge against his former friend. Nor did he know how close Wickham had come to succeeding the summer before when he persuaded Darcy's young sister to elope, only to be thwarted when the girl foolishly confided their plans to her brother. Wickham did not mean to be thwarted again. "Indeed," Wickham said, "now that you have mentioned it, I do recall having heard something or other about an engagement." Here again he shot his friend a look, silently urging him not to contradict what was being said. Denny remained silent. "Does your sister's engagement account for your being in town?" "Oh, yes," said Lydia, "although I was very vexed in having to be away from Meryton and all my good friends for so long as it shall take to plan the wedding." She shrugged. "Alas, Mamma insists. It is a good thing we saw the two of you today, or I shall have gone mad. One can only be away from one's closest friends for so long. After giving his friend yet another telling look, the four of them formed two pairs as Wickham offered his arm to Lydia and deliberately allowed Denny and Kitty to outpace them. "You strike me as someone whom I can trust to keep a secret, Miss Lydia, for what I am about to confide in you must remain between the two of us. Would you like to hear it?" "Oh, yes," Lydia cried. "Your secret shall be perfectly safe with me," she promised, knowing full well that whatever he was about to say, she planned to repeat to Kitty as soon as she could. "Actually, it is more of a request than a secret, but I am relying upon your promise to tell no one." Tenderly flirting, Lydia leaned closer, a silent promise of sorts. What a pleasing view of her décolletage she thus afforded a gentleman with Wickham's predilections and knowledge of the world. "I am particularly acquainted with Darcy House, as I spent a great deal of time there during my youth. There's a particular spot in the garden that I should like to show you, tonight if possible. That is, if you will agree to meet me." What an intriguing request, Lydia silently considered. Time alone with Mr. Wickham tonight, just the two of us. Her creative imagination could not help but consider the best possibility of happiness such a scheme entailed. This can mean only one thing. He intends to court me. Hiding the fact that she felt a bit weak in the knees to be the recipient of such trust and such unabashed admiration, she said, "Sir, if I did not know better, I might suppose you were a mind-reader, what with your ability to grant me such a wish before I had a chance to voice it aloud." "Then you will meet me?" She nodded her head. "And you will say nothing of this to anyone? It shall be our secret." Again young Lydia shook her head up and down. "My lips are sealed." Chapter 12. His unwavering love. Try as she might to understand the Countess of Matlock's cool civility, Elizabeth could not. The grand lady had been so cordial to her and Jane upon first making their acquaintance at Darcy House, and that was just a few weeks prior. That was before her ladyship learned of my engagement to her nephew, Elizabeth reminded herself. I pray she did not also cherish the notion of an alliance between her nephew and his cousin, Miss Anne de Bourgh. Elizabeth barely attended the conversation as her relations went on and on about their delight in being in London during the season. The remembrance of how Mr. Darcy's other aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, had borne the news could not help but command the greater portion of her thoughts. When I was first told of this, I could not allow myself to believe it. But how does one refute such a scandalous notion of an involvement between the two of you, when your own behaviour confirms it? She pointed her walking stick at Elizabeth. "Is this how I am to be repaid for my benevolence towards you, young woman?" "I'm sure I have no idea of what you're accusing me, your ladyship." "Then you deny that you're involved in a scandalous liaison with my nephew Darcy." Darcy stood. "Before you go any further, you should hear what I have to say. I know not the source of your information pertaining to my involvement with Miss Elizabeth, nor does it matter. We had planned to keep this solely between the two of us until Mr. Bennet could be informed. However, I will not have you slander Miss Elizabeth. The fact is, I offered her my hand in marriage today, and she accepted. Other than Elizabeth, there was but one other person in the room whose face did not speak to their astonishment. Elizabeth's friend Charlotte. Lady Catherine's face took on a heightened shade of pale, and she nearly stumbled and fell. All heads turned when her daughter Anne raced from the room. Elizabeth, in all her joy of receiving a proposal of marriage from the man of her dreams, had taught herself not to suppose Anne might be truly wishing that same joy for herself. Poor Mr. Bourgh! How horrible it must be to have her hopes and dreams shattered in such a manner as this. Standing, Elizabeth headed off behind her. Lady Catherine said, "Where do you suppose you are going?" "I mean to have a word with Mr. Bourgh." "And what do you intend to say?" "I mean to explain." "Explain?" "Explain. You mean to explain to her how the pretensions of an upstart like yourself have been the means of thwarting the favourite wishes of her dearest aunt, Darcy's own mother, my own sister, Lady Anne, that my Anne and Darcy should be united in wedlock, while in their cradles we planned their union." What a heart-wrenching experience that had been. Mr. Darcy had effectively severed all ties with his aunt and cousin in the aftermath of the events in Kent. With a family as small as his, the last thing in the world I would ever wish to witness is a rift between Mr. Darcy and the Fitzwilliams. As much as I love him and he loves me, I would never forgive myself were I somehow the means of his losing anyone else whom he holds dear. Family is everything. Indeed, all her family from Hertfordshire, as well as her aunt and uncle from Cheapside, were at Darcy House having dinner that evening along with Mr. Darcy, Georgiana, and all the Fitzwilliams save the Kent contingency, Lady Catherine and Anne. Elizabeth glanced about the room to see how everyone was getting along, what with such vast disparities among their stations. It bothered Elizabeth more than a little to have her Aunt Mrs. Phillips present, for the latter never missed the chance to be vulgar when she could. Being in company with the Earl of Matlock and his wife made no difference. Mrs. Phillips was more than a little impressed with all the grandeur and opulence surrounding her, and she did not try to hide it at times, going so far as to question the price of the golden candelabras adorning the table. At least Elizabeth's mother had the presence of mind to temper such inclinations when in the presence of the Fitzwilliams. The best Elizabeth could manage to mitigate her embarrassment was to seat Mrs. Phillips as far away from Lord and Lady Matlock as the rich mahogany dining-room table would allow. Her uncle Mr. Phillips Elizabeth excused from such machinations, for he was nothing if not amiable, a stark contrast to his wife. How grateful Elizabeth was for the presence of her uncle and aunt Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man, greatly superior to his sisters, as well by nature as education. Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was an amiable, intelligent, elegant woman, and by far her niece's favourite aunt. Elizabeth made sure that both of the Gardiners were seated closest to the Earl and his wife. As the evening's gathering was intended strictly for the two families to get acquainted with one another, Mr. Darcy's friend Charles Bingley and his family were not included among the guests. Little had occurred by way of a formal courtship between Bingley and Jane, and playing matchmaker for those two was not uppermost on Elizabeth's mind on that particular occasion. That Bingley's sisters were excluded by default was ample reward to offset any disappointment Jane may or may not have suffered. Elizabeth arranged for Jane to be seated close to the younger sisters, Kitty and Lydia, hoping they would follow the elder sister's example of how proper young ladies ought to comport themselves during such a formal occasion. Alas, they did not. "Lady Matlock, did you not see Lydia and me in Mayfair today? I thought surely you did," Kitty asked, when a lull in the conversation presented itself. The regal woman reared her head. "Indeed I did, young lady. Just in case you're wondering why I failed to acknowledge the two of you, you ought to know I am not in the habit of responding to those who would cause such a public spectacle." More than one person in the room could not help but be affected by her ladyship's tone, Elizabeth included. She blushed, and blushed again with shame and vexation. She could not help frequently glancing her eye at Mr. Darcy, though every glance convinced her she had nothing to fear in that quarter. His eyes spoke of his unwavering love for her. Kitty would not be deterred. "But we only meant for you to invite our friends from Hertfordshire to the dinner party you're planning for our sister, Mr. Denny and Mr. Abruptly she yelped. "Mr. White," Lydia interrupted. Kitty gave her sister a puzzled look, silently questioning the latter's motives in, first, kicking her under the table, and second, lying about the officer's name. For Lydia's part, it could not be helped. Wickham had sworn her to secrecy, going so far as to tell her she was to say nothing of his being in town. Ignoring her sister, Lydia continued, "The officers should have been excellent company, I am sure." She picked up her linen napkin and dabbed her lips. "I do hope there will be dancing after dinner, for I dearly love to dance." "Lydia," Elizabeth said, her voice admonishing. "Oh, Lizzie," she exclaimed, crumpling her napkin and tossing it across the table. "You are no fun at all." The napkin only made it so far as one of the candelabras. The cloth burst into flames. One of the many footmen standing nearby made quick work of dousing the fire before any real harm was done, but the damage was done all the same. Elizabeth was really embarrassed, as were Jane and Mary. Mr. Bennet looked as though he was dismayed, but he said not a word. Mrs. Bennet was beside herself out of concern for her dear Lydia's safety. Lydia and Kitty could not help but giggle. Whatever were the feelings of the Fitzwilliams, they were not easily discerned, save Lady Matlock's. She was appalled. Indeed, her look spoke volumes, confirming Elizabeth's suspicion that the Countess had judged not only her family but Elizabeth herself, and in so doing found all of them wanting. No one was more relieved than Elizabeth when it was time for the ladies to adjourn to the drawing-room while the gentlemen stayed behind for port and cigars. The task of reining in her wild sister fell to Elizabeth, and she did her best to do so by taking Lydia aside. "Pray, mind your behaviour, Lydia," Elizabeth demanded. "Are you deliberately trying to make yourself ridiculous in the eyes of Mr. Darcy's relations? What advantage can it be for you to offend them?" Alas, All of Elizabeth's rebuking words were lost on the younger girl who had insisted that she did nothing wrong. Accidents happen, Lydia had maintained, a stance bolstered not only by Elizabeth's mother but her Aunt Mrs. Phillips as well. Elizabeth threw her hands up in the air. Is there any wonder Lydia behaves as she does? She is the worst combination of our mother and our Aunt Mrs. Phillips. The tiresome manner in which they both coddled to Lydia's every whim might very well lead to the downfall of us all. Soon enough, the gentlemen rejoined the ladies, and the card tables were placed, obliging most of the party to sit down to whist. Here was a means of tempering the younger sisters, Elizabeth was sure, for Lydia had always taken a great interest in the games, especially when she was winning, and what was good for Lydia was almost always good for Kitty. Alas, even this particular diversion was insufficient to satisfy Lydia for long. She more than anything wanted to dance, and fiercely supposed it was the thing to do in a gathering of their party's size. She prevailed on Colonel Fitzwilliam, the Earl's second son, to join her. It must have surprised no one who knew her best that Lydia had singled out the Colonel as the object of her girlish flirtations that evening. He was the only gentleman in the room donned in military regalia. Always the consummate gentleman, he said, "I should be happy to oblige Miss Lydia, but whatever shall we do for music?" Lydia said, "Mary, you must play something for us. Anything will do. Perhaps a lively Scottish air, and you cannot possibly object because we all know how much you like to perform." In consequence of being the only plain one in the family, Mary worked hard for knowledge and accomplishments, and was indeed always impatient for display. However, it seemed that particular evening was different. Perhaps the prospect of exhibiting before royalty without having practised extensively beforehand was the reason for Mary's reticence. "I think I would rather not play this evening, Lydia," Mary solemnly declared, pushing her spectacles closer to her face and resuming her attention to her book. "Oh, Mary, you're worse than Lizzie. None of you are any fun." Her arms spread open wide, Lydia started twirling about the room. "I shall simply have to pretend there is music, for A large vase went careening to the floor and crashed into pieces. Now it was time for almost everyone in the room who knew the history of the precious artifact to be appalled. Elizabeth surely knew, having inquired about it specifically upon first laying eyes on the beautifully crafted heirloom. "Lydia!" Elizabeth cried, racing over to the fallen object. She was not alone. Darcy was directly on Elizabeth's heels, as was young Georgiana. The latter burst into tears, prompting her brother to embrace her. Elizabeth said, "Look at what you have done, Lydia. This vase dates back to the 15th century. It has been in the Darcy's family for more than 150 years. "La!" Lydia exclaimed. "The 15th century! Why, that makes it—" Here, Lydia paused and began estimating the heirloom's age using her fingers. 16, 17, 18. Why, that is the oldest vase I have ever seen. That old thing should have been thrown out a long, long time ago by my calculation." She shrugged. As rich as Mr. Darcy is, surely he can afford a newer one. Just as they did at Longbourn, Kitty and Lydia shared a bedchamber at Darcy House. Sitting on the large four-poster mahogany bed an hour or so later, rubbing the front of her leg below the knee, Kitty said, "Why did you kick me under the table at dinner earlier?" "Why, I had no choice. You were about to blurt out Mr. Wickham's name, and I could not let you do that," said Lydia. "Why?" Kitty inquired. "Because he made me promise not to tell anyone, and you know how I always keep my promise." "He made you promise what?" "Oh, Kitty, Wickham means to meet me in the garden tonight after the household has settled." Young Lydia had often been described as a scandal waiting to unfold by those who really knew her. Even her own father took a measure of comfort in knowing that. Why exercise caution as a means of intervention with destiny? She only wanted opportunity, he liked to say at times in her presence. By her own father's account, she was one of the silliest girls in all of England. Out in society at the age of 15, and free to do as she pleased, with no real consequences, exercising measures to rein her in was pointless. Such was the way things were when at home. Why would they be any different in town? Slipping out of doors, under cover of darkness, would be easy. Kitty clapped her hand to her bosom. "How exciting!" "Indeed," said Lydia, lifting her skirt just so with either hand and dancing about the room. "I promised not to say a word of his plans to anyone." "I'll never tell," Kitty said, which was entirely in keeping with her character, easily going along with whatever was happening around her, because she appreciated her younger sister's devil-may-care sensibilities. Getting swept up in Lydia's drama was second nature to Kitty. "See that you do not," Lydia pounced on the bed. "You know what this means, do you not? That Wickham fancies you?" "More than that," Lydia waxed poetically. "He means to court me." She clutched a fluffy pillow to her bosom. "Just imagine. Soon enough, there shall be 2 weddings for Mama to boast of to all our friends." Kitty said, "Perhaps there will be 3 weddings should Jane convince Mr. Bingley to fall in love with her again." "La, you are correct. 3 daughters married, Mamma will surely go distracted." As had become their habit since the Bennets began staying at Darcy House, Darcy and Elizabeth stole away to his library that evening after the household had settled. Such times alone with each other had been their greatest solace. Her legs tucked beneath her, Elizabeth sat cradled in Mr. Darcy's arms, with her head resting against his broad chest. The dim glow of the embers in the fireplace cast a romantic light about the room. "Thank you for your indulgence of my family this evening," Elizabeth said in a voice barely above a whisper. Darcy kissed her atop her head. "Thank you for indulging mine," she scoffed. "The Fitzwilliams are a paragon of virtue by comparison, I assure you." "Every family has its fair share of virtues and faults," Darcy responded, despite the fact that the youngest Bennet daughter's unseemly behaviour was precisely as he had feared it would be. Thoughts of his earliest opinions on a possible courtship with Elizabeth came to mind. The situation of her maternal relations, though objectionable, had been nothing in comparison to that total want of propriety so frequently, so almost uniformly betrayed by Mrs. Bennet, by Elizabeth's 3 younger sisters, and occasionally even by Elizabeth's father. Not wanting to offend Elizabeth by pointing out those defects of her nearest relations that she could not possibly be blind to, he had chosen to keep his concerns to himself, and wisely so. Elizabeth and her elder sister had always conducted themselves so as to avoid any share of such censure, and it was Elizabeth with whom he planned to share his life. The inconvenience of uncouth connections was a small price to pay for the joy of having her as his wife. That time seemed like a lifetime ago. Darcy congratulated himself yet again on having kept his thoughts to himself when offering his hand to Elizabeth. Otherwise she might be feeling even more distraught over the events of the past few hours. Elizabeth loved her family with all her heart despite their deficits. He was sure there was nothing she would not do for them, regardless of how it might affect her own felicity. This was but one of the reasons Darcy loved her. He was not about to let the indecorous sensibilities of others prevent him from spending the rest of his life with her, in utter and complete marital bliss. "I have just the thing to take your mind off all that transpired this evening," he said. "I don't know that I shall ever forget the look on your aunt's face when Lydia knocked over the vase," Elizabeth responded, her voice full of remorse. "I don't know who suffered the greater share of mortification, your aunt or your dear sister. I am so sorry." "Elizabeth, you need not apologise. What is done, said Darcy, his voice reassuring. Standing, he silently urged Elizabeth to do likewise. He took Elizabeth by her arm and guided her a few steps across the room, stopping before a mirror on the wall. "Close your eyes." Elizabeth did just that. He moved around behind her and retrieved his gift for her from his pocket, an emerald necklace. Mr. Darcy placed the gift around her neck and fastened its gold clasp. "Open your eyes," Darcy beckoned, his hands on either side of her waist. When she opened her eyes, her expression was all that Darcy hoped it would be. "Sir, these are divine," she said, rubbing her fingers across the stunning stones. "Another family heirloom," he said, "but not nearly so divine as you are, my love." Tearing his eyes away from their reflections in the mirror, he trailed sweet, lingering kisses along her long, oh-so-exquisite neckline and about her shoulders. The titillating spark of his touch coursed through her veins, giving her a sense of what it must be like to spend her life with this man as his lover and as his wife. "Soon," she reminded herself. "Please accept this as a token of my undying love for you," Mr. Darcy whispered, his voice deep and velvety. "Nothing and no one shall ever tear us apart." Chapter 13. Dreadful news. Darcy House had not experienced a quiet day since the Bennet ladies took up their temporary residence there. However, on that particular day it was much too calm, especially given the hour. As it turned out, there was a good reason for the peaceful atmosphere. Elizabeth learned from her mother that Lydia was feeling poorly, and had gone so far as to request that only Kitty should be allowed to see her, and provide the much-needed tender loving care required to nurse her sister back to health. 2 hours turned into 3 hours, which then turned into 4, and still there was no sign of Lydia or hint of her recovery. Elizabeth decided to check on her sister for herself, for if Lydia was truly as sick as Kitty suggested, a doctor ought to be summoned. Such was Elizabeth's thinking as she stood outside the room. After gently tapping on the door, Elizabeth slipped inside. There Kitty sat on her bed, the surprise on her face evident. Lydia, however, was nowhere to be found. "Where is Lydia?" "I'll never tell," Kitty said. "She made me promise not to tell a single soul about her plans." "Kitty," Elizabeth explained. Quickly deciding she would get nowhere with an attack on her sister, she said, "I know how close you and Lydia are. I also know how much you value your secret affairs. However, Lydia is not here. Who is to say what may have happened to her? London, despite all its pleasant diversions, is a place rife with dangers. You would never forgive yourself if Lydia met with any harm." Kitty giggled. "Oh, but Lydia is not in London. She went away last night, and I know she is safe, for she's with one of the officers in Colonel Forster's regiment." "Kitty, what are you saying?" "I shall tell you, but only if you promise to keep Lydia's secret too." "I shall make no such promise, not before I know what has happened. Now tell me at once." "Very well, but it will ruin the happy surprise that Lydia has planned." "Happy surprise?" Elizabeth's body began to shake. "Has Lydia—" Kitty nodded her head. "Yes, Lydia and Mr. Wickham have gone off to Gretna Green. They are to be married. Is that not the happiest news you have heard all week?" Elizabeth grabbed her sister by her arm. "Kitty, you foolish girl! Are you out of your senses to have stood by silently and allowed us to fret over Lydia all day, thinking she was ill when all along you knew she had run away, had thrown herself into the power of a man who does not care for her?" Kitty burst into tears. She hated being yelled at. She hated being the means of disappointing anyone, for that matter. It could not be helped. Elizabeth was angry. "Stop crying," Elizabeth demanded. "Come with me this instant. It is imperative that you tell Papa everything you know." "Oh, Lizzie, do I have to?" Kitty asked, trying to free her arm from her sister's tight grip. "Papa will be so angry. I do not know how to face him." "You ought to have thought of that when you conspired with Lydia to keep her secret, and in so doing deceiving us all." Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bennet were both in the library, lounging in large leather chairs, each with a book in hand, when Elizabeth and Kitty found them. Until that very moment, when Elizabeth's eyes met Darcy's, she had managed to remain calm. It was all she could do to placate Kitty, who was beside herself with remorse. Now 2 tearful ladies stood before the gentleman, fidgeting, and unable to find their voices. Darcy, in wretched suspense, arose from his seat and hurried to Elizabeth. "Good God, what is the matter?" cried he, with more feeling than politeness. Then recollecting himself, "Pray, have a seat, my love." By then Mr. Bennet had come to Kitty's aid. "Let me call your maid. Is there nothing you could take to give you relief? A glass of wine. Shall I get you one? You are very ill." "No, I thank you," she replied, endeavouring to recover herself. "There is nothing the matter with me. I am quite well. I am only distressed by some dreadful news which I have just learned from Kitty. It has to do with Lydia." She threw an aggrieved glance at Kitty. "Oh, it is all my fault," Kitty cried. "I should never have kept Lydia's secret for so long as I did. It's all my fault." "Heavens, child," Mr. Bennet said. "What on earth has happened?" Elizabeth said, "It's Lydia. She's run away. She has eloped. She has thrown herself into the power of Mr. Wickham. They're gone off together to Gretna Green. She has no money, no connections, nothing that can tempt him, and yet she has absconded with him. I fear she is lost forever." "This is grave indeed," cried Darcy. "Is it certain? Absolutely certain?" "Oh, yes. Kitty confessed the whole of it to me. It seems Wickham and Lydia have met secretly several times over the past few days. He persuaded her that he was in love with her, and that the 2 of them were meant to be together. He persuaded her to keep the knowledge of his being in town a secret because he knew the consequences of his being discovered would not bode well for their future felicity. And he convinced her to elope with him so that no one would ever come between them. That wretched man," Mr. Bennet said. "There is nothing to be done now but to go in search of Lydia. Pray to God she has not met with harm. Heaven only will help that scoundrel if she has." With that, Mr. Bennet turned to quit the room. "Papa," Kitty cried, "where shall you go? What will you do?" "It is not as though Lydia is completely without protection. I shall head to Cheapside and ask for your uncle's help. Who is to say where our efforts will lead? but it is inconceivable that I would sit idly by and do nothing. Mr. Darcy said, "If I may, sir, I will join you. I have every reason to suppose I can be of service, and as you say, it is inconceivable that I would sit idly by and do nothing as well." Later that same day, Mr. Bennet and Mr. Darcy arrived on Gracechurch Street to meet with Mr. Gardiner. The men were shut up in the latter's study for hours. Occasionally looking about the room, Darcy perfectly recalled his first time in being there, the time he spent there with Elizabeth. He recalled how excited they were, having received Mr. Bennet's blessing to be married by way of a letter. How depressing it was to be there now in such circumstances as they now faced. How had it come to this? Darcy needed not to speak the name. The audacity of that vile man to announce his presence in my life once again in such a disgusting manner. Hence Darcy's purpose in being there. He argued it was his duty to step forward and endeavour to remedy an evil which had been brought on by himself. Wickham's actions had been motivated by his hatred for Darcy, and his solemn avowal to exact revenge for what Wickham believed was a grave injustice to himself, one perpetrated by Darcy. Though Darcy had ample explanations to bolster his claim, he needed only to put forth one of them: Wickham's greed, which was fuelled by his hatred toward Darcy for denying him the living in Kympton that he believed ought to have been his. The events of the day, alone, were enough to persuade Mr. Bennet and Mr. Gardiner that Darcy had correctly surmised Wickham was not fit for the clergy. By the gentleman's calculations, Wickham and Lydia could have fewer than a day's head start on them. That was assuming they had fled London without delay. As it was, Lydia had excused herself from the party earlier than the others the evening before, complaining of a headache. Surely they would head off the wayward couple long before they reached the Scottish border, which was over 300 miles away. It would take at least 4 days to complete their journey, allowing for frequent stops to rest, to have food, and to change horses. Darcy knew his former friend too well to suspect that he would not seek some form of lodging, however shabby, along the way, given his vile nature. There was also the possibility that he would defile young Lydia Bennet and abandon her by the wayside. Given all that, Darcy would be entirely remiss if he did not consider the likelihood of their not having left London at all. What if Wickham only meant to ruin the young girl with as little inconvenience to himself as possible? He could accomplish that aim in London, in some seamy establishment, as easily as he could anywhere else. As urgent as it was to set off for Gretna Green in pursuit of the couple, prudence dictated that a cursory search of London was absolutely called for, which meant further delay. For Darcy's part, he meant to engage his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam's aide, in order to broaden his reach, but first he needed to speak with Elizabeth. As bright sunlight poured through the towering windows, there Elizabeth sat, staring out over the garden when Darcy entered the room. Her expression was totally devoid of the happiness she had enjoyed since coming to stay at his home, their future home as man and wife. Darcy hated Wickham for what he had done in stealing away with Elizabeth's younger sister. Still, for Elizabeth's sake, Darcy hoped it was not too late to salvage the situation, to hunt Wickham down and do whatever it might take to make him marry the foolish girl. Part of him feared his own future happiness depended on it. Clearing his throat, Darcy approached Elizabeth. He confided in her all that had been discussed with her father and her uncle. Darcy said, "Elizabeth, my love, while your father and your uncle insist it is not my place to intervene in this matter, I have persuaded them that I am ideally suited to aid in the search. I, better than anyone, know what Wickham is capable of. I was not able to persuade your father to allow your mother and younger sisters to remain here while we pursue the runaways. I believe he is informing your mother of his decision for them to return to Longbourn as soon as their speedy departure can be arranged as we speak. As for you and your eldest sister, he says the choice is yours whether you stay here or go to Hertfordshire." A loud uproar ensued, the all-too-familiar sound of Mrs. Bennet in the throes of agony and despair. Trying his best to ignore the disruption, Darcy said, "Please tell me that I do not ask too much in urging you to stay here. Mr. Darcy, if my mother and younger sisters are to leave, I believe it only makes sense that I should go with them. We ought to face our detractors as one. I understand why you would say that. Really, I do. However, this scandal is your sister's, and I will not deny or try to minimize its devastating implications on your family's reputation. I refuse, however, to allow it to disrupt the life we have planned with each other. I need you here, in my home, safe from censure and any speculation of what this means for our future as man and wife. Cupping Elizabeth's face with both hands, he brushed his lips against hers. His kiss was tender but commanding. "Say, you will be here when I return." She nodded. "I will." Mr. Darcy pushed aside an errant lock of her hair, and leaning forward he kissed Elizabeth again. "Thank you, my love. I promise to do everything in my power to ensure a better outcome than is currently expected." Chapter 14. The Greater Cause. As foolish as Lydia Bennet was in having consented to an elopement, she had managed to persuade her companion to allow her the privacy of her own lodgings. Upon being discovered more than 150 miles away, she was most adamant on that particular point, citing she was raised better than to allow such liberties outside the sanctity of marriage, much to her dear Wickham's chagrin. Oh, the irony. Little did it matter. Having spent a single night away from the protection of her relations was all it took to destroy her reputation, as well as that of her family. The Bennets of Longbourn in Hertfordshire were ruined. There was only one thing to be done, according to Mr. Bennet's way of thinking. George Wickham and Lydia must be married. Mr. Gardiner agreed. They all had travelled thus far, there was no point in turning back. As for who was to go with the couple to Scotland, a decision needed to be made for such a scheme required only 2 additions to Wickham and Lydia's party, one to attend the girl and another to keep track of Wickham. Darcy successfully argued that he ought to be the one to keep an eye on Wickham, and as far as Lydia was concerned, the services of a female companion from the local village were to be sought, all at Darcy's expense, an expense that also was to include the purchase of a commission, preferably far, far away in the north, for Wickham, who had effectively abandoned his position in the militia, as well as a generous settlement, which included paying off his gambling debts and funds to spare to set the newlyweds on a sounder footing than they otherwise might have enjoyed. This scheme was not only sound, but it was also entirely palatable, for both of the other gentlemen recognised it to be out of Mr. Darcy's love for Elizabeth. Soon enough Mr. Bennet and Mr. Gardiner returned to their homes with news of what was to be done. By the time of the former's arrival in Hertfordshire and the latter's arrival in London, Lydia would be forever known as Mrs. George Wickham, a circumstance which would surely please her mother as well as herself, but nobody who had an inkling of what Wickham was really like could approve. Mr. Bennet was particularly affected by what all had occurred. He had very often wished before this period of his life that, instead of spending his whole income, he had laid by an annual sum for the better provision of his children and of his wife if she survived him. He now wished it more than ever. Had he done his duty in that respect, Lydia's satisfaction of prevailing on one of the most worthless young men in Great Britain to be her husband might then have rested in its proper place. As for allowing the newlyweds to be received at Longbourn, Mr. Bennet declared he knew not what the future held, but as for that particular point in time he had no intention of doing so. "I will not encourage the impudence of either by receiving them at Longbourn," he had declared to his wife upon his return home. Strangely enough, his sentiments were akin to those of his cousin Mr. Collins, who had expressed his opinion using words to the following effect: "I am truly rejoiced that my cousin Lydia's sad business has been so well hushed up, despite the scandalous circumstances before the marriage took place should be so generally known. I must not, however, neglect the duties of my station, or refrain from declaring my opinion that you must not receive the young couple into your house now that they are married. It would be an encouragement of vice, and one the rector of Longbourn ought strenuously to oppose." How odd to be of a similar accord with a man like Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet could not help but consider. How odd, indeed. Lady Matlock entered the room where Jane and Elizabeth were sitting with a particularly ungracious air. Other than a slight inclination of her head, she made no reply to Elizabeth's salutation. She sat down and spoke to Jane instead. "Miss Bennet, may I prevail on you to allow me to have a private audience with your sister?" Jane, as if sensing this was not exactly a social call, looked at Elizabeth and, upon receiving a silent confirmation from her dearest sister, excused herself from the room. After a long pause, Lady Matlock began speaking on her motive for being there. "When I learned that you and your eldest sister had chosen to remain here in town rather than abscond to Hertfordshire with the rest of your family in the wake of your youngest sister's scandalous elopement, I could not believe it. I had to come here to see for myself." Despite the unpleasant feeling in her stomach, Elizabeth looked at the woman with some dismay. She could not be entirely surprised that Mr. Darcy's relation had spoken to her with such malice. Lydia's behaviour was beyond the pale. It mattered not that Lydia was now a married woman. The damage wrought in bringing it about had tarnished the Bennet family's good name so much that they no longer wished to show their faces in town. Even the ensuing reception among their Hertfordshire acquaintances was wanting. Elizabeth said nothing. "What do you have to say for yourself?" her ladyship demanded. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Tell me what you would have me say, your ladyship." "I beg your pardon?" "I suppose your ladyship would have me apologise for what occurred, but have I not done so already? What more is there for me to say? It is not so much what I would have you say, young woman, as it is what I would have you do." "What would you have me do?" asked Elizabeth, her voice more than a little flat. "Why, I would have you do what you know in your heart is the right thing to do, to return to Hertfordshire where you belong. No good can come from your being here after what has happened. You aspire to that which your station in life rendered you ill-qualified, that being to marry a wealthy man. The situation of your family was destined to unfold as it did. It is better to congratulate yourself for success, however fleeting, and then surrender for the greater cause, that being the protection of my nephew's good name." Elizabeth, feeling limited by Lady Matlock's imposition of authority, resisted being dominated and controlled. "I love Mr. Darcy, and it has nothing to do with his wealth. He is the best man I know. He, more than anyone, deserves to be happy. He has assured me that his happiness lies with me." Her ladyship scoffed. "I do not deny that my nephew deserves to be happy. Do not suppose for one moment that you are the sole source of said happiness. He has his family." Elizabeth nodded. "True, and I know how devoted he is to his family. I also know Mr. Darcy would choose me over his family, were he forced to do so. He has proven it with Lady Catherine and his cousin Anne. I could never wish for him to sacrifice anyone else. He has already lost so much, his mother at a tender young age when a child is most in want of a mother's love, and then his father when a son is most in want of his father's guidance." Elizabeth looked at her ladyship pointedly. "But what does that mean to you? Your being here is confirmation enough that you're only thinking of yourself. I have no doubt your nephew would not approve of this visit if he knew you were here speaking to me in such a hostile manner. How dare you speak to me this way? I have known and loved my nephew since he was in his cradle. I have loved him as I have loved my own sons all his life. I have been more than an aunt to him. I have likened myself to a mother to both my nephew and my niece since our beloved Lady Anne's passing, as you ought to have done. No doubt you have longed for the chance to secure a match for your nephew with a young lady who meets your own exacting standards of what a proper wife ought to be. One who was educated in one of the first private seminaries in town, one with a large fortune, a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages, and whose lineage is as lofty as your own. Who of sound mind would not wish for such an alliance for a loved one? My nephew deserves a partner who will elevate his station in life, not one who will anchor him in place or, worse, tear him down. Say you, but what of Mr. Darcy's own opinion on what he deserves? Do you dare to sit here and suggest that were you in my position, you would not think and feel precisely as I do? Do you really expect me to believe you would argue against a loved one making a match with someone who is his or her equal or better? Mr. Darcy is a gentleman. I am a gentleman's daughter. That alone makes us equals. You're a gentleman's daughter, but what of your mother? What of your uncles and aunts? Your Gardiner relations may appear on the surface to be above reproach, but the mere fact of their living in Cheapside proves who they really are. All this I knew beforehand and was willing to overlook. The disparaging testimonies of Darcy's relations in Kent, by way of frequent letters, I had dismissed as well. Even the horrors of the dinner party at Darcy House as a consequence of the impropriety of your Hertfordshire relations, I was ready to overlook. But the ensuing scandal of your youngest sister's infamous elopement put an end to any possible forbearance on my part, as well as the part of any of Darcy's other family. Is such a girl to be my nephew's sister? And her husband, that vile George Wickham, is the son of his late father's steward to be his brother? Heaven and earth! What are you thinking? Are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted? Whatever my connections may be, said Elizabeth, if your nephew does not object to them, they can be nothing to you. That is where you are mistaken, young woman. My nephew is too much of a gentleman to do what he must surely know to be in the interest of his sister, the rest of his Fitzwilliam family, and even himself. He is stubborn enough to keep his commitment to you if for nothing else but some misguided sense of honour, when the truth is that all his friends, his relations, and society in general will applaud his courage for having severed such disgusting ties. And thus, I must appeal to you to do what honour forbids my nephew to do. End this engagement. Return to Hertfordshire where you belong, and allow my nephew to carry on with his head held high. If you will not do it solely for him, then do it for his sister Georgiana, who has her whole life ahead of her. Does she deserve to be tarnished by the stain of your sister's foolishness? How ironic that Lady Matlock would mention the one thing that had caused Elizabeth to waver, in her commitment to keeping her promise to Mr. Darcy, that she would not do anything rash as a result of Lydia's elopement. That being, the impact of it all on Georgiana. As the granddaughter of an earl, what a bright future awaited the young lady. Marriage to a wealthy gentleman was no doubt a certainty and possibly a peer. Heaven forbid a connection through marriage with a disgraced family would ruin her marital prospects. At length Elizabeth said, "The scheme you so eloquently propose would surely serve your purpose in getting rid of my family and me, but it would certainly redound to your detriment, for Mr. Darcy will always remember your part in separating him from his first love, his first choice. That said, how I conduct my own affairs will be my decision and mine alone, I assure you. And as you have insulted me in every possible way, I see no purpose in further debate. Before you take your leave, however, I ask you this. Will living with the certainty of your nephew's resentment truly make you happy?" Chapter 15. Think better of it. A little over a week later, Mr. Darcy returned to London with every hope of resuming things where they had left off before the Wickham debacle with his dear betrothed. Except Elizabeth was not there. In her place was a letter. "My dearest Fitzwilliam, please do not be alarmed or too disappointed in receiving this letter. Though cowardliness is my abhorrence, I know that were I to have attempted to express in person the things I am about to say in this letter, I would not have been able to remain firm in my conviction. I am returning to Hertfordshire to be with my family during this time, as we seek to regain our former good standing in the community in the aftermath of Lydia's infamous elopement. I cannot stop you from following me. Indeed, I suspect you may feel obliged to do so. I would urge you, however, to think better of it, for as much as I love you, the thought of my being the means of your severing ties with yet another member of your family on behalf of your love for me is more than I can bear. I have come to know that hardly anyone in your family approves of our union, and after witnessing my family's appalling behaviour, I cannot say that I blame them. That, coupled with Lydia's scandal, must surely reaffirm their disapproval. I fear you would face the very real possibility of having to choose between a life with me or a life with those who have long meant so much to you. I'm sorry, sir. I love you so much. My family, as imperfect as they are, mean the world to me. I would never forsake them, and I could never live with myself if, by marrying me, you, in effect, would give up yours. I have Lady Matlock to thank for making me see that which I ought to have seen the instant I learned what Lydia had done. To restate your aunt's precise words, the ensuing scandal of your youngest sister's infamous elopement put an end to any possible forbearance on my part, as well as the part of any of Darcy's other family. Is such a girl to be my nephew's sister? And her husband, that vile George Wickham, is the son of his late father's steward to be his brother? Though those same words, if uttered by your aunt Lady Catherine de Bourgh, might have fallen on deaf ears. Coming from your aunt Lady Matlock, they take on a new, more urgent and indeed sound reasoning, for I would be entirely remiss were I to allow the follies, nay the scandal, of my family to taint yours, especially your sister Georgiana. Georgiana, who is indeed above reproach, surely does not deserve such censure. Neither do you. Enclosed you will find the ring. My actions will no doubt cause you pain, but I would hope the reasons which have compelled your relations to denounce my family and me will resonate with that part of you that knows our parting of the ways is for the best. Regrettably, sir, this is the only way. In closing, I will only add, God bless you. E.B. Chapter 16. Family obstacles. The doors of the drawing-room flew open. Darcy stormed inside the room. "What have you done?" he demanded. "What is the meaning of this, nephew? How dare you march into my home and speak to me in such an appalling manner, in front of servants no less?" Darcy threw an angry glare at the young women attending his aunt. "Leave us." Upon receiving a confirming nod from her ladyship, the servants quit the room. "I hope the purpose of this visit is precisely what I think it is," said Lady Matlock. "Pray, have a seat so that we may proceed calmly." "What did you say to Elizabeth?" Darcy demanded, refusing to sit. "I did what I had to do. I can only hope she was prudent enough to heed my counsel." Darcy knew how much his aunts liked to get their way. Unlike Lady Catherine de Bourgh, however, Lady Matlock was an amiable creature, much adored among her sphere. She generally avoided too much conflict, but had a strong inner desire to take over when need be and do things the right way, steadfast in her insistence that whatever she did was for the good of her family. Moreover, she could be combative, creating adversarial relationships with those who stood in her way. Darcy's restraint and respect for boundaries and Lady Matlock's usual aversion to conflict had often complemented each other. Both of them valued independence, but now Lady Matlock had gone too far. "You had no right." "Nephew," cried Lady Matlock, "you are out of your senses to align yourself so willingly with such a family after all evidence confirmed their appalling lack of decorum. Someone had to do what is right. Pray your ladyship, before you embark on a long litany of reasons against my marrying Elizabeth, let me assure you that there is nothing you can say that I have not already considered. In vain I struggled. It would not do. My feelings would not be repressed. I considered what I was about from every possible angle. My sense of her inferiority by rank and circumstances, of its being a degradation, of the family obstacles. All these things and more I considered and found they meant nothing to me. I love Elizabeth most ardently. I have found in her everything I have ever wished for in a woman." Lady Matlock drew a deep breath. "How can you be so nonchalant when it comes to such things as you espouse? Miss Elizabeth is a lovely young woman, but beauty fades, and girlish wit and charms quickly grow thin with the passage of time. She is now, and no doubt always will be, the handsomest woman of my acquaintance. The passage of time will only amplify her beauty in my eyes, and, most importantly, in my heart," Darcy declared. "Will you be just as enamoured of her wit, which egregiously straddles the line of impertinence and impudence, in a couple years as you are now?" "I am sure I will never grow bored with her, which is more than I can say about any other woman of my acquaintance. It seems no matter what I say, you shall remain determined to have her, which is a grave mistake on your part. It is one thing to choose a woman who, through no fault of her own, lacks good breeding, but to be totally devoid of accomplishments. What must be her excuse? If you care not how this will affect the Fitzwilliam family as a whole, then consider your sister, who shall soon make her own debut in society. Surely you can see that having relations the likes of that wild Lydia Wickham," she spat out the appalling appellation, "will redound to Georgiana's detriment should the former's scandalous behaviour be more widely discovered than it already has been." Darcy would not be dissuaded. But by the grace of God, the scandal that befell Elizabeth's youngest sister might have easily touched Georgiana. I dare not allow that to affect my own future felicity. I beg your pardon, how dare you compare that harlot to your own flesh and blood? Has your so-called love for Elizabeth Bennet poisoned your mind against your own family to such an extent as to cause you to cast aspersions on my niece? I resent your insinuation, your ladyship, no more than I resent yours. Georgiana is a paragon of virtue, and not to be besmirched as a means of justifying your marrying into a family so far beneath your own, in consequence, as to be considered laughable. Weighing whether to shed light on his purpose in comparing his sister and Lydia to his aunt, took little to no time to consider. He had never betrayed his sister's confidence for his own purposes. Now was not the time. The point was that in his heart he could never be so hypocritical as to judge Elizabeth's sister, or even her family, for a fate that his own sister had barely escaped. If others in his family chose to do so, so be it. His sister, as well as his closest friend, his cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam, knew the truth. None of his other relations really mattered. As his aunt said, he was determined to have Elizabeth. Nothing anyone might say or do will change that. "I love her, and beyond that nothing else matters," Darcy said, his voice resolute. "As heartless as this seems, nephew, I tell you this from a place of deep affection. Fall in love with someone else. You would be far better off. Do you know that young woman had the audacity to suggest that were you forced to choose between your family and her, that you would choose her?" His voice stern, Darcy replied, "You have seriously misunderstood my character, your ladyship, if you suppose for one instant that I would not." All alone. Some hours later, Lady Matlock had much to consider in the wake of Darcy's stern rebuke. She hated being at odds with him, but what had she said that was untrue? Her nephew was a young gentleman who was blessed, in a peculiar way, with everything the heart of mortal man could most desire: splendid property, noble kindred, and extensive patronage. None of which mitigated the trials he had suffered during his life, the likes of which she would not have wished on her worst enemy. The loss of his mother and a most beloved father, the first while he was but a boy, the latter on the heels of his reaching majority, and both far too soon. Her thoughts on all he had endured and all she had done on behalf of her nephew in the ensuing years filled her mind. How long Darcy had been alone, and how she had tried and failed to put suitable young ladies of the ton in his path, thinking he might never fall in love. Not that falling in love was a prerequisite for an advantageous alliance, not in their sphere. Her own marriage had been arranged for the purposes of combining two great families, and looking back over the years, she found she had no cause to repine. The fact of the matter was that she wanted more for her nephew. He deserved to have both, a love match and an advantageous alliance. He claims to have found the former in Miss Elizabeth Bennet, and I can have no reason to doubt he believes it. However, there is nothing advantageous about their alliance, especially in the aftermath of her family's tarnished reputation. If wanting nothing but the best for my nephew, and by extension my niece, is wrong, then I am guilty as charged, her ladyship spoke out loud. Elizabeth's parting words about living with Darcy's resentment entered unbidden into her head. What if all the young woman espouses is true? Am I really willing to take that chance? Chapter 17. The means of reuniting them. Longbourn Village. All eyes were fixed on Mr. Darcy when he walked into the room. His own eyes settled upon one person, Elizabeth. Her dark eyes were as bewitching as ever, as was the slightly embarrassed, slightly questioning half-smile on her face. On the one hand, the exchange of all the usual civilities was over in an instant. On the other hand, they seemed to drag on and on. When at last that part of the visit had ended, Mr. Darcy turned to Mrs. Bennet. "I know this seems rather untoward, but I would like a private audience with Miss Elizabeth." Mrs. Bennet clasped her hands over her mouth, and she arose from her seat with alacrity. "Why, of course, Mr. Darcy," she began corralling her daughters. "Come, Jane and Mary. Come along, Kitty." Save Elizabeth, all the Longbourn ladies were gone directly. "You're here," Elizabeth said in a tone barely above a whisper. Mr. Darcy stepped towards her, closing the distance between them. He took her hand in his and nodded. "I am here, my love, determined to make you my wife." "But," Elizabeth began. He cradled her chin in his hand and rubbed his thumb across her lower lip. Her heart pounded. Part of Elizabeth wanted to back up a step or two, the part which she ignored completely. "No buts," he said, gazing into her eyes. "You are my everything, Elizabeth. You are my hopes. You are my dreams come true. I mean to spend my life with you." Darcy retrieved a ring from his pocket and slipped it on her finger. A perfect fit. "Mr. Darcy," she cried, "it's beautiful. By far the most beautiful ring I have ever seen," she added, while beholding its magnificence. Indeed, this ring was twice the size of the first ring he had given her, the one she had returned by way of her letter to him. "You will have noticed this ring is different from before," he said. "It belonged to my maternal grandmother. She gave it to her firstborn son, my uncle Lord Matlock, who gave it to his wife." Her stomach fluttering, Elizabeth's eyes pooled with tears. "Lady Matlock wanted you to have it. She gave it to me, so that I might give it to you, my dearest, loveliest Elizabeth." I, Elizabeth began. "I know not what to say." "Elizabeth, my love, you are everything in the world to me. My morning light, the midday sun, and the stars at night. You are the air I breathe. Say you will be my wife." Elizabeth felt weak in the knees. This was her dream come true. Indeed, the happiness which Mr. Darcy's declaration produced was such as Elizabeth had feared she might never feel again upon taking her leave of London, and she expressed herself on the occasion as sensibly and as warmly as a young woman violently in love can be supposed to do. They had kissed before, just as in this case Elizabeth had been the initiator, but never had the two of them kissed like this. If not for her general suspicion that her family was perched just outside the door, she would have endeavoured to make it last, and last. A jolt of pleasure arched through her body. Recalling her surroundings, Elizabeth eased back a little, breaking their kiss. It seems, Mr. Darcy, only one thing remains to be done." She took him by the hand and coaxed him towards the door. "Our return to town?" he asked. "What if I told you I also brought along a special license?" "I would say you're a wise man indeed. However, the one thing I am referring to is of a more immediate nature." His brow raised, Mr. Darcy responded, "Oh?" Elizabeth opened the door, quickly stepping aside to prevent being inadvertently knocked over by her relations, who tumbled inside. With every appearance of composure the Bennet ladies could muster, they assumed an attitude of proper etiquette and decorum, an attitude that immediately gave way to their enthusiasm when Elizabeth held up her hand just so, displaying her ring. The ensuing excitement was enough to arouse Mr. Bennet from his library. Rushing into the room with a newspaper in hand, he said, "People, what on earth are you about?" "Oh, Mr. Bennet," cried his lady, "Mr. Darcy has come to take Elizabeth off our hands. Can you believe it? Finally, the answer to all our prayers. We are saved." Mr. Bennet tucked his newspaper under his arm and extended his hand to his future son-in-law. He reached out his other hand to Elizabeth. "I offer the two of you my heartfelt felicitations and my most earnest wishes for your future happiness. I cannot imagine two people more worthy of each other's love." Happy was the day Mrs. Bennet got rid of her second eldest daughter, for now she had two daughters married. Indeed, her work was nearly halfway done. It had not gone unnoticed by Mrs. Bennet that Mr. Bingley was growing more and more attentive to her eldest daughter, Jane. He had even returned to Netherfield Park, which was undoubtedly a step in the right direction. It was far better Jane and Bingley should marry later than she had initially planned. What with his abrupt departure from Netherfield the prior year, than never to marry at all. With the advantageous alliance between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, Mrs. Bennet's urgency to see the other girls married off was severely lessened. There is no shame at all in boasting of 2 out of 5 daughters being married. At least that is what Mrs. Bennet could often be heard saying. All in all, no one was really too disappointed by Mr. Darcy's marriage. That is, so long as one did not count the scores of single women in the ton and their disappointed mammas, or Charles Bingley's younger sister, Miss Caroline Bingley, whom Elizabeth had successfully endeavoured to avoid as much as she could during the days leading to the wedding. Well, there was the matter of Mr. Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, but as she and her nephew had suffered a parting of the ways when he was last in Kent, nobody really counted her. Darcy's other aunt, however, must surely be counted. True, her ladyship, in doing what she supposed was in her own family's best interest, had been instrumental in Elizabeth's decision to leave town. Elizabeth's philosophy, however, had long been to think only of the past as its remembrance gave her pleasure. When admiring her ring, she could not help but be pleased, and reflect on the fact that in giving Mr. Darcy the precious family heirloom, the one her ladyship had long cherished as a favourite possession, and encouraging him to give it, along with her blessings, to Elizabeth, Lady Matlock had in effect been the means of reuniting them. You've been enjoying Expecting His Proposal, Expecting His Wife, written by P.O. Dixon, read by Christopher. Thank you for listening. We truly hope you enjoyed it, and will share your thoughts in the comments. Your continuing support makes all the difference in helping us bring more stories like this to YouTube. In addition to commenting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. To our growing community of channel members, thank you for being here. Not yet a member? Join today for special perks, including minimal ads during the early listening period and much more.